Yeah, that's why I brought the backpack.
Okay, that's
Allison, Shelley.
Okay, good morning. Okay, glad you all are here. Before we get started with the panel, I just want to say that I thought that the presentations yesterday were sensational, and I think it's very difficult to go off in the field for a few weeks or sometimes longer, maybe even months, to work on a project for several months, and then to come here and say everything you said in 10 minutes. That is a skill and a talent that will serve you well, and I was very impressed with that. I also think from your stories that you told yesterday, you have developed a lot of flexibility, or you always had it, and that's another great trait of a journalist. And now I'm going to turn this over to Catherine, and we'll start the first panel.
Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Catherine and I'm Associate Editor here at the Pulitzer Center. I'm here to introduce our 4 lovely panelists this morning who are all prior Pulitzer Center grantees. We have Allison, who's a documentary photographer and multimedia journalist who has been based in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and was for over a year after the 2010 quake, and has been reported from a number of other countries including India, Nepal, Nigeria, Cuba, Ethiopia, Congo, Mexico, Mongolia, and the Philippines. She's been commissioned by publications such as The New Yorker, National Geographic, The New York Times, The Guardian, among others, and is co-director of Women Photojournalists of Washington. We also have Sarah Weiser, who's a photojournalist and reporter based in New York, currently working for Retro Reports, before which she worked for newspapers in Washington, Illinois, and in Utah. She reported from India in late 2014. For her project with Retro Report, which was a look back at the legacy of the population bomb. Emily Feldman is an Istanbul-based journalist who writes about the humanitarian crises resulting from conflict in Iraq and Syria. She has a special focus on women. She's looked at the horrors suffered by ethnic Yazidis last summer at the hands of Islamic State fighters. Visual media producer David Rochkind is a full-time Pulitzer Center grantee and has worked for a diverse range of publications and clients, including the New York Times, Times Magazine, Time, Newsweek, Rolling Stone, the Carter Center, UNHCR, and the World Health Organization. So I guess we'll start with Allison, if you wanted to talk a little bit about your work.
Okay. Are we just going right into the?
Oh, just a second. We have people coming in.
Okay.
Okay, I think there was a delay in Ubers and taxis and that kind of thing, so that explains this.
There might be 2 tabs up there for digital projects.
Okay.
If you want to just go. Oh, maybe
Oh,
not.
yeah.
Thank you. Just
We need Allison.
Yeah, why did
did we just have that one tab open, or did you have the other one too?
yeah, just a quick
Just the one?
That's it.
Okay. I didn't get any photos ready for this, so we're gonna look through. What's that?
Are you looking for Nigeria?
Either one, yeah.
Yeah, I can do that.
So we're just gonna look through. Let's do both because.
Okay.
She's just gonna show some of the pictures I've done for Pulitzer. I've done 4 projects through Pulitzer Center in different countries, working on a lot of maternal health issues is my main focus. In the course of doing this work, I work with a lot of different people, a lot of different sources, and what I'd like to talk about today is working with NGOs. So we'll get very specific. Who here has had to work with or has worked with an NGO in order to get reporting done in the field? Great. Okay. So this is something we're all dealing with. NGOs can be your biggest asset, but also your biggest liability when you're working in the field. And this is a question I get asked a lot. like how, you know, what are the ethical lines working with NGOs? So I thought we'd just talk a little bit about that. NGOs can be a great help connecting you with your story, but they most often represent a specific interest, right? So we know the purpose of non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, is to espouse a certain, you know, line or political viewpoint, promote a particular course of action, protect a certain people group, focus on one aspect of a larger issue. That means that they're coming at whatever your topic is from one side in general. And who can tell me why that's a problem?
Shows bias.
Bias, yeah. Has anyone experienced that in the field? Has anyone like found themselves in a corner because of that? Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, do you want me to stand up?
Sure.
So I was doing some reporting when I was in Iraq, and I was in the Kurdistan area, and like I ended up going into some refugee camps with people from the PKK, and so it was really, and it was like a nonprofit that worked with the PKK, and like I just, my reporting obviously like was impacted by it because people thought that I was in alliance with the PKK.
And did you do anything while you were in the field to sort of like counter that? What did you do?
I essentially just got like I got another nonprofit that kind of balanced out. Like mostly like I included that voice in my reporting, and then like I went out with that nonprofit like, you know, 2 days later, but like, yeah.
Great. And that's a great way to do it, sort of find the other side, right? Do it. Somebody else had their hand up over here. Anybody else want to talk about that? Okay. Cool. So that's a great example of why you should never rely on an NGO for your sole source of information. I always seek out officials, opposition groups, local organizations, activists who also might espouse just one side of an issue, but you know, also will help you circle around your truth a little bit more. Sometimes an NGO is your only way into an issue. When I was living in Haiti, it was the time when cholera happened for the first time in, 100 years, cholera came to Haiti. You know, and you were going to the neighborhoods, you were seeing people that had it, but to see people being treated, you had to go into a cholera treatment center. And to get into those, you had to go through one of the organizations that was dealing with that. One of the big ones was a group called Samaritan's Purse. And they had very specific guidelines about what you could do when you were in those centers, who you could talk to, and they would not let you see the people who were in the final stages. So they were trying to show you a very particular part of how cholera is treated, what their organization was doing, that they were saving people. They didn't want you to see the people who were not making it. And that was a problem for me. So, you spend your days in there, you say, thank you very much. And then you try to circle around the issue another way. And for us, that meant going into the neighborhood, talking to people. And we had a lot of trouble finding, pictures that could show what does cholera do to a person in the final stages. So sometimes you have to be very creative. But you always have to be asking yourself those questions. Sometimes an NGO is your only way to a location where something is happening. Last year, I was in DR Congo reporting a story on what it's like to be pregnant in a conflict zone. And there was a particular part of Eastern Congo called North Kivu. Probably a lot of you guys have been reading about things happening there. The conflict is still happening in the hills there. And there are some little towns way out in the middle of nowhere where it's particularly bad. And it's so bad that every other organization is gone from there. The government's, support is very minimal. And the roads also to get out there have not been maintained for those reasons. So the only way out there, the only group that was working out there was MSF, Doctors Without Borders. And the only way they were getting out there was by motorcycle convoy. And they had a particular line every morning. This was incredible to me, but every morning, the leader of that particular organization would get radio calls from all the different rebel groups in the area. And they would tell them where they were, what their movements were going to be for that day, and what village they were going to attack. And in return, MSF provided, medical care to all of their wounded fighters. So that was their deal. So they were the only way in. And so they basically took us by motorcycle into like 5 hours each direction into these small villages where literally you're climbing across rope bridges to get to the village. And at that point, you are completely under the care of an organization. And you need to be aware of that kind of thing when that happens. What are they giving you? How are they supporting you? You know, and what are you giving them in return? And that's really important. What are you giving them in return? MSF, when I first started working for them, asked me to just provide them with some of my photos, you know, just that. And I said no, because I wanted the discretion to be able to control those pictures. And ultimately, I did give them a handful of pictures for each place I went, but I didn't want that to be a blanket agreement. And that's an important point. You have control over that deal, you know? So when you go into a place like that, you may be like, oh, this is great. We're getting into this remote village. We're doing these things, but what are you giving up? Those are questions that you really need to ask yourself. And what is that deal? Make that deal. You've got the power to be able to lay that out any way you'd like, you know, respecting what they're giving you. An important part of that is how do you deal with what they are giving you? I always pay my way, right? And no more. And that's the next important point. If you are being taken somewhere, if they are taking you by motorcycle somewhere, they're putting you up overnight, which they did for us for 3 or 4 nights, they are feeding you. You need to find out what that cost is and reimburse it. That's what we did. And it was, you know, it was very cheap, but that's something that we felt was very important. We don't want to owe this organization anything. We want to pay our way. We want to be able to give them that. But what happens when you know, give them more? If they ask you, oh, can you just, you know, bring us these supplies, do this thing for us? Then you start getting into the territory of, you know, you're a journalist. You need to think about what it is you're there for, you know, and not paying any more than what your due is. And that's a tricky line. That's a much longer conversation. So the last point I have here is beware of conflicts of interest. This is a particular point for, I think, photographers like myself. I've gotten calls from organizations that have brought me into the field to then later do work for them. You know, we liked your work. You did a great job on that story. Can we hire you to come, you know, fly out here and shoot for us? And the answer for me is always no. And you need to find out the answer for yourself. What are your ethical lines? Where's your, you know, what is your ethical line as far as like what you will then do in the future? I do work for NGOs, but I never work for NGOs that work in the field that I work in, which is maternal health. And I never do paid work for groups that I've been taken into the field, you know, from. And that's you know, that can be a problem if you do get a lot of your income from that kind of work. You need to think about that kind of thing. And then I guess there was one more point. Be clear about what NGOs have given you when you publish. So I find it, one of my ethical lines is when the story comes out, when you finally, you know, publishing that story, I try to be very clear about this organization helped us get into the field. They gave us this support, so that the reader is clear that there was an NGO helping us along the way. And they can make their own choices about how they perceive that, but that is all above board so that later it doesn't come back and somebody's like, well, you know, you're biased on this side or that side or whatever. So those are my main points. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
So you say you do some work directly for NGOs that aren't related to your stuff.
Yeah.
So that's just for them. You don't do that work for your own journalistic interest, maybe try and get something published.
Yeah, I separate those two things. And some people even have a problem with that. They would not do even that. I think writers have a different line with that. I think it's a little trickier for writers. The writer that I normally work with on these stories doesn't do any NGO work because it's perceived slightly differently. But photographers, for some reason, there seems to be an okay
So many great projects are being funded by you.
Right, and that's fine. I think I have problems with that, and I've been approached by several groups that are like, we will bring you here to do this story, and I won't take that money. I won't do those trips just because I feel like that's a conflict of interest for me.
Right.
Allison, if you're shooting for a publication, newspaper, magazines, or you're selling them something that you've already shot, how often do the editors ask you about this? So you've got a nice personal ethical line.
Mhm.
I'm wondering, do they hold you accountable to that when they buy your stuff?
I've never had an editor ask me about that.
So it's right here for you.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a newspaper photographer for many years, and we had a pretty strong, we designed things at most of the papers I worked for that said, here's my ethical line. So it's just something that's sort of always been in my head. Like, you don't cross, you don't take gifts from your subjects. You don't give them certain, So yeah, I want to be, there's credibility at stake here. We're journalists. For me, that's the most important thing. Where is my credibility coming from? If I'm seen to have a partiality to a group, then I may be perceived differently as a journalist. I may not be perceived as a journalist.
I think we should go on to the next speaker, and then we'll have questions.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Emily, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience?
I'm going to talk a little bit about ethics in the field. And the reporting that I recently did for the Pulitzer Center with the Yazidis made me think about this quite a bit because this is, well, first I'll just back up a little bit and tell you just briefly what this topic is. The Yazidis are a religious minority in Iraq, and they were targeted by ISIS when ISIS pushed into Iraq in the summer of 2014 and made headlines all around the world for what was done to them. Many were killed, and most shockingly, a lot of them were kidnapped and enslaved and remain enslaved. This was a sensational story that a lot of newspapers wanted to send people out there to get these very sensational headlines, which are very easy to do, very available. And I actually just Googled this morning Yazidi, and I checked Google News, and here are some of these sensational headlines that are continuing to come in. I was a blue-eyed Yazidi teenager describes ISIS sex slave market, which that headline alone should raise some flags. This is a teenager who spoke to, not the Daily Mail, it was the AFP actually, about being a sex slave. And these are standards that would not fly in the US if we're talking about a teenage victim of rape, but for some reason, these rules have kind of like gone out the window for this topic. People are so interested in getting these stories. So I was already kind of concerned about this as I was going on my trip, and then this story was published in the Daily Beast, which made me think about it even more. It's a really good story, and I want to read you just like a little piece of it so you get a sense of what this is. The deck is, the public's interest in knowing explicit details of sexual violence must not outweigh these victims' urgent need for safety and privacy. And I'll just read you the lead because it's powerful. It has been more than 50 years since a British journalist who came across a group of Belgian nuns in war-ravaged Congo was heard to shout, "Anyone here been raped and speaks English?" But the callousness of that line, made infamous as the title of a book by veteran correspondent Edward Baer, remains with us today. If anything, the cynicism and exploitation of the victims may be worse. So I read this article, which comes out the day that I get on the plane to go report on this, and now I'm like having a crisis and hoping that I don't fall into traps and wind up harming people. So I decide while I'm on the plane, I have to make rules for myself. I can't be on the ground deciding what my rules are going to be. So I decide that the world already knows basically what has happened to these women. So many of these stories have come out. NGOs, ISIS itself published a lengthy article explaining what they were doing to these women. So is there news value in going back and asking these women to tell their stories again and again and again? And I decide, no, there is no news value. The next step is looking forward. What sort of treatment are these women getting? What is their future? How are they getting out of ISIS captivity? So that has to be my focus. And if along the way it is relevant, I can, on a case-by-case basis, decide whether I'm going to even go there. But once you're actually out there, you could think that it's quite easy to keep this morality, but there are sometimes moments where you're tempted to break your own rules. And I'll just tell you a quick story of when I had a little bit of a conflict, because a very cool thing happened, like journalistically cool. I kept on speaking to these women and asking them about what happened, like, is anyone getting psychological treatment? Where are they going? And they're like, oh, Dr. Mirza saving them. And I'm like, who's Dr. Mirza? And no one can explain to me who this like mysterious man was. But I kept hearing, he's taking us all to Germany. And I'm like, what? Who is this person? Who is Dr. Mirza? So finally I find the phone number for Dr. Mirza, and my translator's calling him. He's not answering the phone. Finally he answers the phone, and he says, oh yes, actually, I have 2 buses of women, there are 80 of them, and I'm taking them to be blessed by the high priest and say goodbye to their families because I'm getting them on a plane to Germany. Would you like to come along for the ride? And I'm like, oh my God. So I'm like, so excited about this, and we take off, and then here I am just dumped with 80 women who are held as sex slaves, and a lot of them are children or teenagers. And now I have my camera with me, and I had told myself there's no reason to photograph anyone, there's no reason to show the face of these people. I have to at least explain to them, who I am and what I'm doing. And yet here I am at this scene of like, my God, I'm in like a Harry Potter temple, and like families are saying goodbye and they're crying and they're about to be whisked off to Germany. And so this was a challenge, and I told myself, okay, I should take the pictures and I could decide what to do with them later. And I go into like paparazzi mode. And then a man who's working for an NGO who was sort of facilitating this whole thing snaps me out of it, because he comes and screams in my face, basically, what are you doing? Who are you? And then I felt like I crumbled and felt really conflicted and bad about it. I talked to him and I explained that obviously I'm not throwing this up on, like, I'm not live tweeting this, and I'm conscious of the ethical concerns that he had. And in the end, the photos were amazing, and I wound up not using them, which was a tough thing, but I kept going back to that Daily Beast article and trying to think about, what the right thing to do was. And basically, I think it doesn't matter if you're reporting on rape or you're reporting on, someone who's being evicted from their home. Like, no one has the obligation to speak to you ever, and you can't forget that. I think it's really important to remember that anyone who speaks to you is doing it not because they have to, and that even if they're not aware of the risks that they're putting themselves in, you have to be. Like, someone might be willing to, yeah, you could take a picture of me, I'll tell you my whole story, like, put it on YouTube, doesn't matter. Like, you are the responsible person in the end, and if they're not willing to think about their safety, you have to. It's a big responsibility, but we can't forget our humanity for the sake of a story. And it's important, like, my conclusion was, like, you have to think about these people as your family members, like your brothers and sisters, and if you wouldn't want your brother and sister to be treated this way, then you cannot do it. Like, a story is never going to be worth it.
Sarah?
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here today. I thought I would just tell you guys a little bit about my experience working in India for a story that I did recently for the Pulitzer Center. I work at Retro Report, a nonprofit documentary news organization. I was working with my colleague Kit Rohn, and we wanted to tell the story about the 1960s fear over the population bomb. There were a lot of scary predictions at the time about what would happen if we didn't control our growing population. And I thought that India, with its history, its kind of complicated and controversial history of population control, would be a good place for us to tell this story. So today I thought I would just touch on basically 3 main points, maybe 3 or 4. The first, and this might be kind of obvious, but I think it's really the importance of pre-reporting and preparation. I was only in the field for a limited amount of time, which I'm sure is probably the case with a lot of you guys. And I think some of that early work is really, really important. And so I basically started by doing a ton of reading, reports, articles, stories. I also found that local coverage, going to, the Indian press and seeing how they covered some of these issues was really important and kind of gave a different perspective that we don't get here. And I talked to as many people as I could. So, professors at Indian universities, doctors in the field, health activists, NGOs, which are great help, but yeah, just something to remember, which we've already kind of spoken about up here, but they do have their own agenda, and so it's good to be aware of what they're doing when you're working with them. So yeah, I mean, this is a ton of information, kind of bringing it all together. My goal is really to tell a human story. How do I boil all this down into something that's personal? I mean, what really does affect women's decisions about family size, and how do I avoid making the story reductive? Because I think, women's experiences vary so much, not just across India, but even within the same city or the same village. And so I ended up planning the trip around 2 different regions of the country: Bihar in the north, which has a much higher fertility rate, and Tamil Nadu in the south, which has a much lower fertility rate and also higher levels of literacy and better access to healthcare more broadly. And so also in advance, finding a good fixer, which I'm sure is another thing you guys have used yourselves, is really, really helpful. And especially not speaking the language. The guy I was working with was really great in some of the connecting me to early people at the beginning who I wouldn't have been able to reach otherwise. So you do all this prep work, but then when you get to the field, inevitably things fall through. And so my second point is really about being adaptable on the ground and kind of taking advantage when things kind of go differently than you expect. With the help of a local NGO, I had been connected to a women's health activist in a remote area of Bihar, and I had set up a visit to a sterilization camp. I learned when it was going to be happening, and we kind of planned that leg of our trip around it. But when I got to the region, I learned it had been postponed. And we're in this remote area. We had only really dedicated a day to this part of the trip, and so we started scrambling. We were calling all our contacts. We showed up at a local community health center and hoping the head doctor there might have some ideas. He didn't, but he turned out to be one of the best interviews that I had had. And he really challenged some of the ideas that I think some people in the West might have about the family planning program in India. And he talked about really the problems of healthcare in remote areas, saying that sterilization targets, which is a big thing in the family planning program, are not necessarily themselves the problem. And neither necessarily are sterilization camps. It's really just the lack of investment, in his opinion, in the broader healthcare system that really leaves both women and doctors with very little options on the ground. So I also had another interview fall through too with a top health official in the state government, and I had done all the prep work. I had planned it ahead of time. We got there early. We set up the lights for the interview, and then he ended up bailing and refusing to sit for the interview. But it's too bad. But I ended up using the time to reconnect with a woman I had met at an earlier at a family planning clinic a few days earlier, and so it was really great to be able to use that time to go home with her and get to know her family and see her at home. And you never really know what'll happen when things go off script and who you'll meet, and that's part of the exciting thing about being in the field. We did find a sterilization camp that day, and I met Lakshmi there. She's an ASHA, or local community health activist. And she, some critics of the family planning program point to the fact that there are these sterilization targets for all healthcare workers, including ASHAs, and also that there's these monetary incentives in place for the procedure. But Lakshmi saw things differently. And she offered to introduce us to a woman from her village that she had brought recently to be sterilized just a couple days before. And so we hopped in the car, squeezed in the back seat, bumping along the road back towards her village. And she was just describing how, she really thinks small families are the best in the interest of women because it allows them to better provide for the children they have and can also have some time to focus on themselves as well. we found Sonia Lakshmi, the woman that Lakshmi had brought outside of her home with her newborn. She had 4 children, and she had gotten sterilized, willingly gone for sterilization a couple days before, after hearing about it from Lakshmi, the Asha. And but as I was talking with her, I realized that she didn't realize there are other forms of birth control available. And so it just, I mean, she really helped to kind of give me yet another perspective, I guess, on this topic, and really give some depth to the coverage and to the story. The last thing I thought I'd mention is something that I think we're all probably experiencing to some degree, and that's taking on multiple roles in the field and being responsible for bringing back different kinds of content. I'm a photographer, and I have begun shooting a little bit of video, but here in India, I was also working as a producer. We had hired a local shooter, and I was constantly trying to, stay aware of what I was shooting and what he was shooting, and also keeping in mind what the broader story needed, in stills, in video, in audio, and also not just what we needed thematically, but the technical elements too. Like, were we getting enough B-roll of a particular city to be able to establish within the documentary that where we were at that point, or like a tight shot of a doctor with a patient and their hands, during an examination. It was also the first time, and this was kind of a challenge for me, working with another shooter in such intimate settings, exam rooms or operating rooms, or one-room home, with both of us, 2 people, 2 cameras, a lot of gear, sometimes audio tripods, audio gear. I realized how overwhelming our presence could be. And I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind too, and be aware of your own presence in the scene. I wanted to close by just saying what may be the obvious, and that's sometimes if you stick around long enough, and maybe not even necessarily shooting the whole time, or reporting the whole time, you'll get lucky. I remember it was at the end of a very long day, the last day of the trip. We were at a small hospital outside of Chennai, I had sent the guys I was working with away to go get food because, they were getting a little bit antsy. But I found myself reluctant to call it a day because, I don't know, I constantly found myself feeling that way throughout the trip. And I was there, and one of the nurses came over to me and said that a woman was about to give birth. And so I was able to get permission from the woman and be there as that happened. And that was really great. And I think, so in some sense, it was lucky, in a way, right place, right time. But I also think, I like to think that good preparation and hard work and hustle really kind of creates that situation where you'll actually be able to have that kind of luck. So, thank you.
David?
I'm gonna skip the microphone, and I'm actually gonna stand so I can obscure.
I'm glad you're standing, but you're being taped.
Oh,
you
so I
might
need
have
to do the microphone?
Does you have to use the microphone?
Yeah,
Yes.
you hear it back here, reading it.
Oh, okay, so I'll use the microphone. And I'm just gonna get to, should I just skip forward?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So much of my work, and this is on automatic? No? Okay. So much of my work over the past several years has been on public health and specifically tuberculosis. And every time I start working on a story, I'm pretty much sure it's going to fail. It doesn't make any sense to me that I'll travel to a place where I don't speak the language, show up in front of complete strangers with a camera, sometimes at their homes, and ask them to allow me to not only talk to them, but also to take their pictures in what must be one of the most difficult and vulnerable times of their lives. But every time I'm amazed at the openness and graciousness and generosity of people who are willing to share those stories with me and who are willing to let me in. And I kind of imagine what my response would be if I answered the door and I saw someone with a camera speaking language that I didn't understand. and they were asking to come in to take my picture or to take the picture of a family member, my mother or my father, as we were battling a really debilitating disease. And I just can't imagine that I'd be as welcoming as the scores of people that I've met over the years working on these stories about tuberculosis and public health. And I think it's important to remember that when we work on stories about crisis or conflict or public health, that we're meeting people at a time when they're incredibly vulnerable and sometimes they're desperate. And this creates a situation where people can easily be taken advantage of, and they can easily be taken advantage of by us, even if it's not what we intend to do, and even if we don't realize that we're doing it. When we work on public health stories in the developing world, we often come into contact with people, with potential subjects through an intermediary that they trust. You know, it might be a doctor, or it might be an NGO, or it might be some other kind of healthcare professional. And in journalism, we talk a lot about building relationships, and especially in photojournalism, we talk about that, the importance of building relationships and building trust. But the reality is that, again, especially in photojournalism, we're often trading on the trust that's already been built between the subject we encounter and the person who introduced us to that subject. And I think that this can often give us a false sense of access or a false sense of agreement from the subject to participate in whatever it is the story that we're working on. And, you know, as was mentioned in one of the questions earlier, it's important to remember that when we're working, we're essentially on our own. You know, there isn't anyone looking over our shoulders. There isn't anyone making sure that we do things correctly or making sure that we treat people with respect. We're interacting with people who are in incredibly vulnerable situations, who often see us in positions of power due to how that relationship was introduced or to other factors in play, depending on where we're reporting from. And in my experience, when you work in resource-poor settings covering issues that affect vulnerable populations, there are moments where you can easily take advantage of people. There are moments where, without lying, it can be easy to bend the truth or omit certain facts in order to get the access you want or the information you think you need or build that relationship with the subject. So here I also wanted to raise the issue of ethics and how we treat people in the field and how we treat the characters in our stories. I think it's especially important in photojournalism when we often think that we have to find the most dramatic moment possible in order to visually represent an issue that on its own is already heartbreaking. And that puts us in a position where we can feel like we're hunting for drama, or we're hunting for death, or we're hunting for sadness. And in that process, we can start treating people like props. Instead of looking for subjects that help tell a story, for example, a story about how technology affects TB diagnosis, we end up only looking for subjects that best tell the story about how TB kills people. And where was I? Right, so in that idea of only looking for subjects that kind of visually represent this idea, I've worked with NGOs who have told me that some photojournalists come to them and all they ask is, take me to the people who are closest to death, or take me to the people who are sickest. That's what I want to see. And they sort of gloss over the rest of the story. And when you're so driven to find and document that kind of drama, it can be easy to overlook the actual people that you're meeting. It can be easy to under-explain what you're working on in hopes that they'll let you in. It can be easy to let a doctor explain for you in a language that you don't understand what you're doing, and sort of just conveniently forget that you don't know what's been explained to the subject and just assume that it's been explained correctly. And it can be easy to tell someone that you hope the result of your story is that their situation might change, when in reality you know that that almost never happens. So I think it's really important to remember and to talk about out loud that in our drive to produce the best journalism possible, we do have to remember to treat people honestly. We do have to remember to treat people with respect, even in those instances when no one would ever know if we didn't. That we don't treat people like props or widgets that we plug in to fill a hole in our story. We don't ask them to go through uncomfortable or difficult experiences for no reason. And we don't push them beyond what seems acceptable, even if they keep saying yes. That we're always open and honest about who we are, what our role is, and what kind of expectations someone should have as a result of collaborating with us. So I'll leave it there for now, but I hope that in the Q&A we can talk a bit more about some of these issues and how they relate to thinking about perpetuating stereotypes and being culturally sensitive.
Thank you. So I have a question for the panel generally. How do you go about finding subjects, either from a distance or on the ground?
I think it happens in a variety of ways. Sometimes through organizations, which I'm sure you guys experienced when you were out in the field. Other times through fixers who have their own network of contacts, and sometimes through relationships that you may have been able to build on your own. So, for example, if you've been focusing on a particular topic for a certain amount of time, you start to develop a network of people that you can tap into, and they can get you in touch with people. But I think the most important thing is to be persistent, especially when you're just dropped into the field. You have to start asking everybody that you know. You have to bother everybody that you know, and cast a really wide net to try to find. Because I think, as others have said, you have to prepare for things to fall through. And even if you feel like you do have the character that you're looking for, if you have the interview set up that you need, you should always be extra cautious and cast that wide net to be sure that in case it does fall through, you have some sort of backup. So I think be persistent and ask everybody that you know, because you'll be surprised sometimes where contacts will come from if you are just chatting with someone at the hotel you're staying at and asking, who do you know? And by the way, do you know someone who? I think that after every interview, when you're finished with the interview, you should ask that person, who else do you know? Or by the way, I'm looking for some people who blah, blah, blah. Do you know anybody? And sometimes they can pull a cell phone out and just start taking phone calls right there. So ask as many people and be as persistent as possible, I think.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. It's kind of like a game of dominoes. Once you talk to somebody, they have 3 people, you talk to each of them, they all have 3 more suggestions. So you are able to kind of follow all your different leads and find the best person. But I do feel like a lot of the people I really enjoyed and learned a lot from in the field were people that I didn't know ahead of time. It was people I came across through the reporting on the ground, talking with a doctor who would introduce me to one of her patients, that kind of thing. So yeah, I would be really open and talk to as many people as you can, because you'll find contacts everywhere.
I feel like it's been covered.
Hi, everyone. I have a question about ethics in regards to kind of navigating other cultures where, like, there's a sense of hospitality, especially around, like, people who they believe to be, like, command respect often, as, like, Westerners do when you go to these foreign countries. So I was just wondering if you could talk about kind of navigating, like, the line between, like, acceptable hospitality and, like, when you're starting to kind of cross a line with, like, accepting things from your subjects.
Like taking gifts or?
Yeah, maybe not even taking gifts, but like meals with people, celebrating holidays, and then, like, how you kind of, it's a little nuanced, but I kind of ran into that when I was abroad. So
How did you see it?
well, I would go to a subject's house, and then it just would happen to be dinner time, and then you, like, sit down and eat with them, and in my mind I was like, well, this is just being a pleasant and hospitable person. But then at the same time, it's like they're feeding me and they're sheltering me for a small amount of time, and, like, there was a holiday while I was there that I spent with people that I had been interviewing. So I just wanted to know if you guys have run into that at all.
Yeah, I think that's a good question too, right? Because all these lines that we make so neatly before we leave are very blurry in the field, right? And you do come in, having to have all your needs met in a place where you don't necessarily have any resource other than money. So sometimes it happens that you're in a place and that happens. I mean, in general, my role is, like, to try to provide what I'm getting back to whoever is giving it to me. So if I show up somewhere and somebody feeds me a feast, and and my crew or the people I'm, my fixer or my writer I'm working with or whatever, ideally I would love to then the next day be able to bring in, go to the market and bring food, and I've done that. You know, I've brought food in. I also personally travel with little gifts, and they're not anything worth money, but like what I found to be, this is hilarious, but what I found to be the most popular thing in several different cultures that I've been to are snow globes with the Washington Monument in them. And I think it's because, you know, a lot of people have never seen a snow globe. It's kind of interesting, right? So I travel with little stupid things like that that are like, when someone does give you something unexpected like that, you can sort of reciprocate with a little, it's a touch of hospitality on your side to say, I appreciate your token. Here's a token from me. That's not, you know, anything expensive, but something that means something. So that's the way I deal with that sometimes.
I think it also depends who the person is. I mean, it's not always a clear rule, never take anything from anybody. If you're in somebody's home and they want to give you tea or dinner or celebrate a birthday party, I think that's fine. If it's a communications officer from an NGO and they want to take you out to a fancy restaurant, that's a totally different thing. So I think it's usually pretty easy to figure out somebody's motives and why they're doing something for you. And if it's just a socially acceptable thing and they're being hospitable, I think it's okay to have to engage with people socially. I mean, that's part of what we're doing, is trying to learn about people and trying to build that relationship and get them to open up to us. It crosses a line if they're sort of trying to buy something from us, you know?
So, thank you all. These are really powerful presentations, and I'm struck by the lack of consensus among you all, and I think certainly in journalism in general, about what these ethical red lines are, what the standards are, whether it's how you deal with an NGO, do you go with an NGO or not? I mean, what kind of image do you take? What kind of disclosure do you give? Permission from the people you're shooting? And then, you know, especially for freelancers, because, you know, in an era when there were a few dominant news outlets, they kind of set the standard for what professional ethics were. And now the environment is so fragmented, so many different outlets. And I think even the leading news outlets of the past will, they'll often go for the image that they might not have taken before. So I'm curious as to if you can think about, if any of you have thought about or could address, how do we go about achieving those kinds of standards? Any kind of consensus on that? I think this is also an issue that I think will come up again with some of the folks from the journalism schools who will be, you know, who are here with us today.
I could talk a little bit about this. I'm a freelancer, and I have had some kind of concerning experiences with editors who I do not think put as much thought into ethical issues as they should have. And I was actually really surprised. I've been doing a lot of reporting on these EDs for different publications, and never once did an editor raise concerns with me about images and or names or anything. And I was the one pushing them. I was very paranoid, and I was bothering the photo editor and making sure, is this, you know, can you see her face? Is the identity obscured enough? And it was tough to get a response, and I was hounding them. And it wasn't until actually I did like a radio segment with the BBC, and they were the first people who said to me, I have some questions about this, or do you think that we're putting anyone in danger by blah, 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 blah? And I was kind of shocked because it was the first time, and I had been doing articles for many different websites. No editor had brought this up. So I do think that there is much more of a responsibility on the journalist to be sure. Ultimately, your name is on it. You are responsible for it. No one's going to know that your editor was careless or that the publication, it's ultimately your fault. If anything happens, if you put anyone's life in danger, et cetera. So it's a big responsibility, and I just think that it ultimately comes down to each person's judgment.
I'd also say there's a lot of different issues. Like some are about funding and bias and how that comes in, and other are just about things like danger and sort of personal doing quality journalism. I think in terms of bias and funding, a good rule is just transparency. At every step of the way, you're clear about, as Allison said, who's supporting you, where you're getting money from, where things are being published, and just at all steps in the process, be transparent about how things happened, and then let the editor, the outlet, or the audience decide how they want to take it. It's a really hard thing because, you know, the Pulitzer Center's existence is testament to the fact that it's really hard to do this kind of journalism, and more, the kinds of people who are funding it are the kinds of people that can influence the way journalism is done. There's a huge difference, also as Allison said, between photojournalists and writers. You know, there's not only is it okay for me to take money from an NGO and report on a similar issue, but sometimes it's celebrated. There's photojournalism festivals that give awards sponsored by NGOs, and editors don't care at all about publishing those pictures. Whereas if a writer got the same award from the same organization, they could never write about that issue for the same publication that would publish my pictures. There's a lot of responsibility on us, but there's only so much we can do. I think the public sort of expects when they go to an outlet, or if they're reading stories from an organization like the Pulitzer Center, they're putting trust in that organization, and they're expecting that that organization has done the requisite work to entrust the reporters or the photographers. But I think overall, and I know this is one of the things the Pulitzer Center sort of preaches as well, is just transparency at every step about what's happening, and then you let people make their own decision about how they want to accept or not accept the stories they were putting out.
Hi, so I just wanted to ask a question about this idea of getting a false sense of access from your subjects. In my experience working in India, a lot of the people that I had used for translation were all physicians, and I think part of that was because they're one of the few sort of people in the institution that could actually understand me and my accent, and also they had enough rapport with the patients to be able to sort of communicate with them, you know, about their lives. But at the same time, you know, I was thinking about the fact that the presence of a physician sort of commands a certain amount of deference from someone who is in a certain socioeconomic situation. And even though I tried to be very explicit about the fact that the patient had full autonomy about what they wanted to tell me, and they could stop talking to me at any time, and, you know, a lot of things to sort of go over like who I am and what my purpose is, you know, I still felt like, I still wondered about whether or not what they were telling me was qualified by the fact that they were just essentially being confronted by two very socially privileged people. So I guess my question is like, how do you sort of navigate, who do you pick, translate for you, and how that might have an effect on communication with your subject?
I always work with a translator that will translate, and this is sort of weird, but I say, I don't want you to just translate the ideas. You have to say exactly what I say, and you have to tell me exactly what they're saying. Because the idea isn't that they're talking to the translator, it's that they're talking to me, and I need to know exactly what's happening. And I think if you rely on someone like a doctor or someone who works with the organization within which you're reporting, you can't really trust what's happening. They might actually be well-intentioned in trying to translate, but if you don't have complete control and you're not the one that's actually having a conversation with the person, then it's really hard to know why they're telling you anything. And especially in this scenario where you're in there with someone in a position of power, like there's so many times when I've known that a patient says, yeah, you can take my picture, but they really have no idea what I'm doing. And for all I know, like, not to sound patronizing, but they might think they really have to do whatever the doctor says because their care depends on it. If they don't, then who knows what's going to happen. So in those situations, I think you need to make sure that the translator is working for you, not working for anybody else, and that you are on the side of caution and just don't do something if you think it doesn't feel right.
Yeah, I strongly agree, and I think, I mean, I've certainly been in countries where I've had different translators / fixers for every neighborhood I've gone to, partially because I want the person that knows that neighborhood, knows exactly what that issue is, but it's always somebody who is unaffiliated with the organization I'm working with, and that's tricky, right? Because especially in the health field, when you're like, you know, you need somebody to understand the concepts you're talking about and the words you're saying, but not be affiliated with the organizations or the hospital or whatever. It can be really hard to find that person. And I have spent, that is probably what I spend the most time on before I go somewhere, is finding that person, So that's hard. One thing I do in the field, which I found to be useful, is I do video often. And what I found is that the translator I use in the field, translating my video, I use in the field, we get the interviews done. And then when I'm finished, either, before I leave the country or later, I'll find somebody in the US who can do this. I will have a different person transcribe that interview. And I do that for several reasons. Number one, to check the translation, but number two, to put a finer point on it, to check the ideas that are coming through, just to make sure that what that person's translating is exactly what that person, the original person, said. And I found that I caught some small, tweaks that have ultimately proved to be very important in my final reporting. So that's one little thing I do.
I was wondering how your experiences have been similar and different in situations where it's a government entity giving you access versus an NGO.
So I just came back from, I just came back from Cuba. And this is probably, I think the battery might have just died.
I've got one for you.
Oh, wait. Hello. Okay. So I just came back from Cuba, which is probably a very extreme example of this, where, we've been planning for this story for months. It was a story we had to go to the government for.
You can give me, I'll change that.
We had to go to the government for it because it was a story on the country's doctor training program. So it was something you couldn't access without the government. And it was one of the most bureaucratically frustrating situations I've ever been in. You get there and there's a center that's called the CPI, the International Press Center, and their job is supposed to be to facilitate everything. And I think it's quite exactly the opposite. They just stall everything. So, in that situation, basically the way we set it up was the first half of the trip, we went to the CPI every day, sat there and tried to go through them. And the second half of the trip, we just went for broke and we just went around them with our fixer. And which we didn't want to do at the beginning because we don't want to piss them off and have everything shut down. But at the end, we're like, we have nothing to lose. We're just going to do it. And that worked. And we got what we needed. And, it was a tightrope because we'd go, talk to these hospital administrators. And by then we had enough, we'd asked the CPI for these letters of introduction and they gave them to us. And we also got a credential. That was helpful. So then we would eventually went to the, hospital directors themselves and said, here's our credential, here's our letter. And they'd be like, okay, great, let me make a phone call. And they would call and just verify that we were legit. And then we had access. And you just never know how that's going to work or if it's going to work. But so we basically had to go, that was the way we handled that. And who knows who we pissed off by doing that. And if I lived there, I might handle it differently. But because we were there for a very short amount of time, that's how we did it. So that's one example.
In that case, is there a consequence for the fixer? What happens after you leave?
Yeah, very good question. Very good question. We did not use our fixer for some of this. In some cases, she put us in touch with people and then we made the phone call to keep her out of the loop. In other cases, people went out on a limb for us and said, you can do this, but here's my limit. Here's how I do and don't want my name associated with this. And that's a very good point because you're leaving people behind who will have to deal with the consequences. Very important. So asking people, and we did ask this question on this trip, was like, what do you feel comfortable with and what do you not? And, how can we avoid getting you in trouble? And it's tricky. It's a tricky thing every time.
I had a question for you guys. So you all have issue areas that you report on that obviously guide the stories that you end up picking. But I just wanted to ask how you choose a story and how you know when you found it.
So I'm really interested in public health, and the reason that I was interested in public health and started working on TV is because I liked the way that issues of health could get you into other issues of development in general in resource poor settings, that someone's a health issue doesn't just impact somebody's health, but it impacts kind of their entire family and the trajectory of their family. So that's in general how I was interested in public health. And I think in terms of picking a story, I think photojournalists often aren't really good at it because we pick issues or topics and not stories. So we go out and we just say, we're gonna work on a project about TV in India. And an editor says, well, what's new about that? And we're like, well, I don't know, but it's a cool thing that it's gonna be good pictures that are gonna be really dramatic, so let's do that. So I think it's just thinking about, the normal things, what's new, what's happening that people would be interested in, how are things changing. A great question to ask that the Pulitzer Center works with the Solutions Journalism Network, and what they say is to ask the question, what are people doing that is working that other people aren't doing? So instead of just focusing on the problem, you think about how is this problem being solved in an innovative way? And I think that's a really useful way to think about it that sort of pulls you out of just focusing on damage and problems and death.
Yeah, I work for Retroport, and so we produce these news documentaries that look back at old news stories and then look at why they're still relevant and important today. And so that kind of helps shape, for my project at least, you're looking at this with kind of a historical eye and trying to figure out how the past is impacting the present, and so that leads you down a kind of a different path, but one that's really interesting and that it took a long time to kind of develop the idea behind my story, but yeah, it was fun to have it come together.
So in my case, there are always news stories that are happening everywhere. They're giant stories, and I think that the key is finding a very small way to tell it, focusing on one thing and not the giant thing. So like, for example, everyone's writing about the global refugee crisis right now. This is a massive thing that's been happening for many, many years. How do you keep people interested in it? How do you make it relatable? And I think finding a small thing, which could be a person, or it could be like, for example, I was recently in Berlin and I found an organization that is starting a coding school, computer programming school for refugees. And I thought this was interesting because the topic that I was interested in and I wanted to communicate to people is this limbo, this waiting period. There are so many news stories about the celebration of actually making it to Europe. Yay, we finally made it, it's over. And actually it's not over. It's kind of dark actually. There's a really long and depressing waiting period before you're able to even begin to integrate. And I wanted to capture somehow, how do you capture this realization that it's actually not over? And I thought that this refugee coding school is sort of interesting, and it's a way to tell it, because through this story I'm able to explain why they're doing this. They're doing this because there is empty time, and these people are looking to help integrate them and teach them a new skill perhaps that might help them find a job when they have the paperwork to actually start looking for a job or launch their own startup. So, and it might even get people who are more interested in technology and things like this, interested in reading about the refugee crisis. So I think it's about finding one small thing to tell a larger story.
Thanks. Excellent points of view. I just really want to say that really quick because totally appreciate this panel. It's been amazing. I was in Berlin during my project, and one problem that I came across as someone who's not a videographer, not a photographer, was how necessarily to navigate that intimacy with your subject and how to gain that trust so that you can take their picture, so that you can record their story. I think I did it pretty simply. I just asked people if I could take their picture, but I was dealing with the Turkish community in Berlin, which is private, and German culture in general is very private in terms of publication. So I was just wondering if any of you had sort of rules for navigating that privacy, that intimacy with your subjects, and if that sort of changed per the culture that you're in.
I think David made this point earlier, but I think in that kind of case, when you have a limited amount of time, I think going in with somebody who people trust is vital, right? And that can be an NGO, that can be an organization that they're already working with, that already trust them and says, here's a journalist that we vetted, somebody we trust, and they're already in a setting, or you have made arrangements ahead of time to have a meeting with them, through the NGO when you explain what you're doing. I think that sometimes is the only way I've made connections in a short period of time.
I'd also say one thing that always happens, especially if pictures aren't your main focus, you'll go and you'll start talking to somebody, you interview them, and then it's over, and it's time for pictures, and they say, okay, what do you want me to do? Or you think, okay, well, what are we gonna do now? How do we do this? And I mean, the real answer is just time. If you have limited time, there's only so much you can do, and you have to be aware of what you can achieve in that amount of time. One way to get pictures that aren't just people sitting around or aren't just portraits is not only to go in with somebody that they trust, but to go in when something is happening, where it's not just them sitting around wondering what they should be doing for you, but if they're, in public health, if a healthcare worker is going to their home to give them medicine, then you can sort of go one day, meet them, tell them what you're doing, get permission, go back the next day when the thing is actually happening and take pictures. So it's not this uncomfortable thing, and you don't necessarily have to spend a day getting to know them and sort of see their daily life. And I think that that's valid for, education or any other issues, sort of figure out what is truly happening and separate the image making from the time you're spending just talking to somebody.
Yeah.
More questions?
This might be a controversial question, but I was wondering if there is any time when it's okay to obscure the fact that you're a journalist in order to get access to a place, whether that's like to an authority or bureaucracy, or
Did you have a situation like that?
Kind of. The village office where I worked in a tribe in northern Tanzania, and they'd been scorned by journalists before who came in and took pictures of inappropriate things and like really, I don't know, like made the image of the village to. Anyway, so they were a bit wary of journalists, and so I had to play up the fact that I was a student and that I had done research in the area before. So I really relied on like my previous experience and my previous reputation. And then it was like, I'm gonna go continue this, but I'm gonna publish it. There are people who look at this, but I never like, I don't know. I told them I was working at the Pulitzer Center and that it was published, but I don't think I used the word journalist because it seemed to have like a negative connotation.
I would say, unless it's concerning like our safety, that the one golden rule is to always be open and honest about who you are and what you're doing. And we have to accept the consequences of people who have come before us. We have to set a good example for people who come next. And we have to be okay if people aren't willing to participate with us because we're journalists. I say that 95% of my job is getting to the point where I can take a picture and 5% is actually taking a picture. And that 95% is sort of convincing people that even though I'm a journalist, there's a reason for you to collaborate with what I'm doing. And that's sort of the one thing that I think isn't really a gray space. Like, I always have to be open and honest with people. I'm a journalist, this is what I'm doing. And you can do all the things that you say, explain how you're different from other journalists who have come before, how the work you're doing is different. But in my opinion, I don't feel comfortable obscuring the fact that I'm a journalist.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's all about, that's why we're there. Sorry, I'm sitting. And I think not being honest about that is not good for the story, not good for your relationship with your subject, and not good for future journalists too coming in. Because it is, you're working with people who came before you and people will be coming in after.
I'll just add that it does happen a lot in the field, and you'll see, like, I know that a lot of the big stories like ISIS artifacts, for example, there are people who are pretending to be potential buyers to be able to actually see the artifacts, and there are people who are doing undercover stuff to find smugglers, and I agree with what everyone is saying, that that's a problem and it does make it more difficult for other journalists to come after. But you have to sort of stick to your guns and do the right thing.
Yeah, I completely agree with everybody else. I was in a weird situation, maybe Sarah, you had this too, in a place like Bihar. And also it happened to me in Western Nepal where I went into communities that were so remote that people didn't know what a journalist was. And that was an awkward thing because people seemed to be open to the camera, but they didn't understand that these pictures were then going to be very public. And so the burden really was on me to explain these pictures will be very public, and are you okay with that? And it was a burden, like having to explain, like, you know, are you sure you want to do this? When really it was against my interest to try to push that. But I ended up like on this document that was like a photo video release kind of thing, and I had it translated into Hindi. And then we were in communities where people didn't read, so I actually had my translator read it to people and just had this like half an hour long conversation with people about what I was doing before I would take a single frame in their homes. And that added just a whole nother layer of interestingness to the situation.
I'd also say that even from 5 years ago, everything we do is accessible now. So when something that happens to me a lot is I'll be talking to somebody and there's issues of privacy. You know, they don't want the community to know they have TB. They don't want the community to know they have HIV. I'm with an NGO that they trust, and they think, well, he's with the NGO and he's from the United States. These pictures are only going to be in the United States, so I guess it's okay. And you sort of understand that they do have issues with privacy, and there is stigma with the issue you're dealing with. So you sort of have to go further and say, well, you know, there is a chance that this is going to be in your community. People you know are going to see this. Is that okay? And you just sort of have to keep going and keep going. I get weird emails all the time of people who have seen my pictures that I would never expect to see my pictures. I get, a few months ago, I was in Jordan working on a project about Syrian refugees in Jordan. And there was a little girl in a family, she was like 7 years old. And like a week after I left, she Facebook friended me. And so it's just like everything comes around. Whatever we don't say, there's a chance that, I mean, aside from if it's right or wrong, there's a chance that people are going to find out what we're actually doing. And I think it's just better to start with honesty and with being very clear about what we're doing, because you never know what's going to come around.
Question back here. I have a quick question. When you guys are, I'll do something coming your way. Okay. When you guys are out reporting and you end up with a subject or someone, have you ever been asked for money for access by a family? And what do you tell them? You know, I've sort of done reporting with the Pulitzer Center for like a while, and especially when you go to, you know, very remote countries, you go to Nepal or, you know, you go to like Afghanistan, meet families. They understand you're a journalist, but they also want money for the, you know, for the access they're providing. What do you do?
I get asked for money all the time. A different thing people wonder is, how am I going to benefit from this? Not necessarily, are you going to give me money, but if I participate, is the NGO going to give me, you know, better access to medicine? Is somebody going to build a clinic here? And I think it's the same thing that we've all been saying. What I tell them is, I'm not going to give you money. I'm a journalist. My role is not to help you. However much I hope that this story will help you, and on a macro level, I believe in the power of journalism to affect change. Your life is going to be exactly the same after I leave. I'm not going to give you anything. Nobody's going to give you anything. I think it's a good thing what we're trying to do, and I hope you'll participate. And pretty much they always agree. But I think, again, it's just being very clear about who we are and what we're doing.
I also, I agree with what you said. And I've also found, though, that if it's possible, sometimes if you can give somebody, if you've taken their photo, bring a photo back to them. Yeah, that you took of them or their family, I found they appreciate that so much, and it's just something little you can give back.
I'll also just say that sometimes I do give people money because I like them and I want to help them, and we're all humans and we're dealing with these really difficult issues, and there's people in need, and $1 can mean a difference to them. And people can decide not to run those pictures if they want. Sometimes I'll decide to help somebody and not use them in the story. But it's not, I think people are they try and be very precise. You never do anything. Don't let somebody even use your cell phone because that would change, what happens with the story. I can't do things like that. And if people don't want to use my work because of it, then that's sort of fine with me.
This is right along those lines, but as far as, I have a lot of people who I spoke with, wonderful people, really got to know well, in reporting, and then afterwards it was, oh, send me these photos, oh, I'm gonna add you on Facebook, let me follow you on Twitter, let me, I'm gonna email you, and all this kind of stuff, and I was just wondering, as far as with your subjects after that, because I'm never really sure how to handle that because they are lovely, wonderful people and I love to keep in contact. And always with will you send me the story? I say, once it's over, once it's published, and I'll send it. But I was just wondering if you guys have had similar situations, which sounds like you have.
Yeah, I think that's why some people have their public Facebook pages. I don't. But I definitely have a policy of accepting friendships from people once the story's out, then I will send them pictures or links or whatever, and then I will Facebook friend them. I tend to not Facebook friend them, accept the request until the story's out. I don't know why, that seems like a line for me though, personally. But yeah, I'm in touch with all kinds of people who I've done stories on.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it could be a nice thing. Like I've actually become friends with some people that were either subjects or their family members were subjects in my story, and we connected over Facebook, and now they're great and they've helped me get more stories. So it could be to your benefit that they can chat you one day and be like, did you see what happened? Or I have some really interesting thing for you. And you could sort of stay in touch and make sure that you don't lose track of the story. So it can actually be quite a nice thing.
I'll also say one way I deal with wanting to be a nice person and giving people pictures and sending them stories, but balancing that with the sheer number of people that we come into contact with, is I'll say, that's great if you send me an email, I'll respond with a picture. And I would say 90% of them never send me an email, but I don't feel like it's my responsibility to send every single person I take a picture of them, but I'd like to do it. And if they care about it enough to send me an email, then I'm happy to respond.
I'll also say one thing, that is, I try to stay in touch with my fixers too, for the same reasons that Emily just said, but also because there are a lot of journalists moving around this world, and if you can connect them with the fixer you used, if you liked your fixer and you're still in touch, Facebook is a great way to stay in touch with those people. It's just karma, and I found that stuff always comes back, right? If you can connect that out, it always circles back around. And people, you're helping somebody maintain their livelihood, right? So that's just.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has any. Otherwise, we will.
Thank you all so much for coming. This has been great. So it seems like all of your kind of ethical codes have been built off personal experience, and you're talking about what is okay and where that line is, and it's slightly different for every person. I'm kind of wondering if you've ever made, whether there's one that stands out, an ethical mistake that has helped guide your future principles, because I think that, I've certainly messed up in the field. I think that we all do.
Sure, nobody
One of the reasons why I wanted to put up some of these pictures while I was talking, because there's tons of pictures where when I still look at them, I'm like, how could I possibly have taken that picture? Like, how is it okay to have done that? Two things that I always remember are, one time I was meeting a mother and her daughter who had HIV, and I was talking to them about trying to take pictures of them. I remember thinking in my head, what do I have to tell this woman to get her to let me take pictures of her daughter? I was like, that's just not the right way to think about things. And another instance that I always sort of think about is
you're taking a picture of somebody and they're smiling, and you think, I don't want them smiling. They're supposed to be sad in this picture. So I think it just all comes back to, I know it's not a great answer, but it all comes back to just being like a nice person and respecting people and thinking about what a good way to treat people is.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's one that always stands out in my mind, because it was literally one of my first days on my first photo internship out of college. I was shooting this like an indigenous ceremony in Washington State, and I had this great conversation with one of the leaders of the organization, and he came up to me after and he gave me a drum, one of the drums that they had used, and I like took it and I didn't even think anything about it. And then by the time I got back to my car, I was like, oh my God, I can't take this. Like, this is really not okay. And so I ran back. I couldn't find him, but I ended up giving it to his son. And but I don't know. That always just stands out to me. Like, don't take anything from anybody and be very careful about it. But yeah, it all boils down to being a good person, I think. So.
Thank you. You have all given us a look at the thought, and I really appreciated you sharing all of these really funny stories about us.
So I think we'll only take a 10-minute break. And if you didn't get a name tag, put a name tag on during the break.
Is there any more questions?
Yeah.
That was so good. Thank you so much.
Oh, this was so good.
Yeah, this was a good one.
All the conversation about ethics and cultural sensitivity. I think it was very, very helpful.
We should do a day on that, like, I don't know, on ethics. Like, do an ethics workshop. Nobody teaches that. No one has.
But you really.
And the lines are so
tan.
tan.
And then, I mean, for this group, I mentioned it in the, you heard out when you're. Yes. Well, it looks great.
It is.
Emily, that was one.
Yeah, like, I got people start talking about it, just doing, like, the day with your, to talk about lines.
Yeah, this is the, they're all doing recording now. So they're going to have steps in there. As we're having politics right now. Yeah, what's the difference? Yeah.
It is a group, there's like 200 of us now, and it's all here in this metro area, and it's all, it's DC based, yeah, Washington is in Washington DC. And it's all women in the field, so journalists, photojournalists, I mean, it's all photo people, or multimedia people, editors, a lot of the National Geographic photo editors are there. And we do a ton of things. We have like happy hours. We have workshops. We sponsor portfolio reviews. We do contests every year. We do special travels to
Do I?
Yeah.
Can you show me what I need to do for the?
Yeah. Well, you
to set up the next.
And we have a really active Facebook site that like every other day somebody's putting up discussions or whatever. So that's really in touch. And when you know you're going to town next, try and see where our events are. We have stuff all the time. Yeah. So yeah, and I mean, since you're in New York,
can you show me how to like what's the setup for the next one? I also didn't saw it started like skipping really quickly.
I know. That's because I made a mistake.
What was that?
Yeah.
So that was I was setting like the timer like after how many, and I thought like this is like I just thought this is like minutes and this is seconds.
Oh.
So actually this is seconds.
Okay.
I always make that mistake. I can never like really understand.
But it was quicker than 10 seconds. It was definitely quicker than 10 seconds. It was like 1 second.
No, that was because before that I set it like 01 here and 00.01. Like I thought that's like means 10 seconds.
Okay.
And then I was like, no, it's like 1 second. I don't know why. Anyway, let's go through it. I think, yeah, that's fine.
bigger language about like.
Really?
And
No, I think you are not like you're not saying things loud we you need to say now we turn to questions. You just didn't say that and you just start ask questions. This is really weird. And also you need just control the whole room. You need to control that.
Yeah.
Like
I've never done it before.
like you need to be a little bit calm. Like more.
I think I'm just too much.
Yeah, keep like you need to be a little bit.
Okay.
That's fine.
So November's a month from today.
Okay.
Oh, so what's what are we doing? Should we start it up in the next one?
No, I need to change the.
It starts as soon as you're 8:30. I mean, I'm sure you've done. I'm sure you have something in personal. Just something that's.
You're the first panel in the afternoon or second one?
Second one.
Second one? Okay, sure. Like my brain isn't working like in the morning.
I sympathize.
Will they have more time to work on projects? They will. That'd be great. Thank you so much. It is, they used to pay for speakers, and now it's like.
Now you can just
Okay, just delete them.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's true, but it's the principle of it. Like they sent this email out and it was like, under any circumstances, you know, I need to do I know, exactly. It's really true. Yeah. I don't know that I'll be teaching anymore. It's a lot of work. And I mean, it's certainly not work. I give them a ton of stuff to do, and yet because I want them to think and understand that this field is hard. In the question of like not really and obviously when sorry. There's not really what. So have you all met Lauren?
No.
I don't know. Not yet, so Lauren. Nice to meet you. I know, like I've had a lot of.
Yeah, we met last night here. I'm married to David Grant.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Nice.
He's I had to actually bring the kids to DC this weekend because he's riding the bus.
Oh, that's
Kyra, Darnton.
Nick, Kyra.
And now is this?
Right?
No, but is this
Where's
our?
Jen?
Is this one of yours?
We have another panel before the student fellows. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No,
It wasn't
he
you.
he was changing. Just I need to wait him change.
You're good. You're good.
And Carol on new slides. Oh my god.
Research is on trauma and sensitivities and for men or women, the top choices. Yeah. So, and then.
Oh, Lauren, I need to talk with you. I need to talk with you. I need to talk with you about because
So you're here.
because Mark Dolan, he wants to show the website, and I'll have the website open here.
Okay, so he's the last one, so we'll just
He's
go
the last
there.
one. You just go there,
Okay,
and then you just enlarge the whole page, and he'll show the two things.
Wait, so how do I, and I won't have to go back to this? Can I just, and then I just click that and press full screen when it's done?
Press this full screen.
So for the questions, I just click here and press full screen? Like after? Because I don't want it to land on this. This will be like the landing page.
That's the landing page.
I'll just probably go back up to the main one. Okay.
I can give you another page. Yeah, you can just go back to this one, the last page. Yeah.
Oh, you have it as the
Sure,
first and last. Okay. Thank you, Jen. Good job. I know. I know it is. I know it's just.
I never want to change the slide at the last minute.
I know. I know.
I don't know why.
We'll trade places, right? So you'll all slide down one when Kyra speaks so that the person.
Oh, I was thinking each of you could stand at the podium when you speak. Is that okay? That way they can actually see you because when you're sitting down, it's hard for everyone to see.
But then maybe Anup should take her place because I think it's too.
We could all just shift down.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, that works. Yeah. So maybe if we can we bring this chair up?
I couldn't bring it up for some reason.
Okay, I'm gonna
I tried.
totally get it. Let me try. So are you at a testing or
It can really put you, like, I mean, basically, because
But I
I'm
just
wearing a
thought
very
Daniel-
different hat than what I was wearing. So basically, what about report two this week? And then,
I'm
not behind. Yeah,
You're speaking or not speaking?
Yeah, and then,
But I think what we'll do is all four of you will speak and then we'll have questions.
Well, those have to stand, David, when they're gonna stand anyway. We're gonna have.
Okay.
So you already have the fun set up, right?
No, I'm just gonna talk about like.
So these two, so then when you finish, you can sit in the next chair.
Okay.
Great.
Am I going first?
Yeah, do it. You are going first.
Once you get hired, then he's.
I'll introduce you.
And intimidating. Yeah.
No.
Right, no, right, Grandma. Oh, yeah.
Comes into the conversation.
What is?
Yeah, but we should talk about it.
So where are the kids at?
I mean, it's crazy. Which one? Okay, good. Good, because the only ones that I have that are nice now.
Okay.
But, it's fine, but my first plan was,
I just like such a bad sore throat.
Everyone in this office does too. The whole, I know, the speaking thing. You're
On
gonna
the
have.
plane, yesterday I was like probably the most irritating person on the plane.
Yeah, it's just like going around like everywhere. Everybody has it. Everyone's octaves are like 2 lower than normal at this time of year. So you'll be. And this microphone is loud if people use it the right way.
Yeah.
Just use it and you won't have to talk very
So
loud.
for the beginning, I can basically just like briefly talk about what I do.
Yeah.
The idea of like, the kind of pictures we're looking for at BuzzFeed, would that work?
That would be great. That'd be a great idea.
And then we can like talk more sort of specifics during discussion.
Right. During discussion, I'll have questions ready, but they'll probably already have way too many questions for me to even get to these questions for them, which is what we want. So, yeah, but you mainly just talk about what you're doing now.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I think we're ready for our second panel. Or we will be once everyone comes and joins us.
I have no idea. I thought you were very ready for it.
But we don't need that anymore.
You're based in DC. Yeah. I just moved to London.
Yeah.
I just had like dinner with Griff
I like that. Nice.
I met the person moved to BuzzFeed and I was like, I worked with Griff for 6 years.
Yeah. Nice. I wanted to leave that.
Yeah. So basically, my editor.
Okay.
The deputy.
We're about ready for the second panel. Come on in, guys.
There's money there.
Yeah. I'm not complaining.
Okay. So I think we're going to get started on our second panel. I'm Lauren Shepard, the Outreach Coordinator here at the Pulitzer Center. I work with Anne and Kim on the Campus Consortium and with all of you student fellows. For our second panel on storytelling and pitching, we have these journalists and editors that have come to explore what they've learned about how you come up with the why to a story. First we have, I'll introduce you all, and then if you'd like to kind of tell a little bit about what you're working on now. Anup Kaphle is the Pulitzer Center grantee, most recently reporting on migrant labor in Nepal. And he's the deputy foreign editor at BuzzFeed News, and was previously the digital foreign editor at the Washington Post, where he oversaw the Post's world coverage on the web. He was previously producer at the Washington Post and digital media fellow at the Atlantic. Anup has reported from Afghanistan and Nepal, and his work has appeared in the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, the Atlantic, and CBC, among others. Then we'll have Nicholas Schmidle, a staff writer at the New Yorker, and he was a 2013 and 2014 finalist in the Livingston Awards for his stories, some of which were on Russian arms trafficking, post-traumatic stress, crimes in Kosovo, murder in Chicago, among many others. Previously, he contributed to the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, New Republic, Slate, and many other publications. Then we'll have Kyra Darnton. She is the managing editor and executive producer of Retro Report, the online news nonprofit that she'll tell you a lot more about. She was previously producer at CBS News and has worked at Videos News International and ABC News. And finally, we'll have Mark Dolan. He's the president of the National Press Photographers Association and is currently a professor teaching photojournalism and new media in the School of Mass Communications and Media Arts at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. And hopefully he'll tell us a little bit about his interesting ride all the way to journalism at age 30. So he kind of went all over the place, and now he's in the world of journalism for good. So I will be talking a little bit about storytelling, data-driven stories, long-form journalism, and how you may convey scientific stories as well. But I think I'll let them get to it, and we'll have a Q&A afterward. So hold your questions to the end. Thank you. Here's Anup.
I'm supposed to stand, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Morning, everybody.
There you go.
I was actually waiting for everyone to say good morning. So my relationship with Pulitzer Center goes back to, I think, about 2008. And right after I finished graduate school, and I went to Nepal to report on the Maoists. There was an insurgency going on. And so I was working for
the Washington Post, and I was trying to figure out a way to pitch the story that had been reported so many times, and many people had sort of like lost their interest over. So early on, I started realizing that, you know, when you are sort of like pitching a story, something like that, you could sort of like, you know, present multiple different aspects. In graduate school, we were sort of taught about the importance of multimedia reporting. So what I did was I was actually reaching out to Foreign Policy magazine for a long form magazine reporting, to the Washington Post for a reported news story, to CBC for a radio story, and to another station for a TV news story. And I think, you know, that's the pattern sort of, you know, I followed throughout. And during my time as a digital sort of foreign editor, we took pitches from outside as well, and we worked with a lot of other Pulitzer Center fellows who reported from around the world. This summer I moved to BuzzFeed, and now I have a completely like different job. I'm an editor, and one of the things I do is not, you know, besides sort of editing our correspondence, we have now 15 people so far around the world. We are huge with taking freelance work from around the world. We take pitches everywhere from like Myanmar to, you know, Bangladesh to, you know, Mexico, anywhere really. And one of the things we're trying to focus on is something that not a lot of like mainstream publications are doing. So right now I'm receiving at least 3 pitches a day on Myanmar elections. It's been about a week, and I haven't liked a single pitch, because everything is just surrounded around, hey, by the way, did you know that there are elections happening in Myanmar? And I would like to do a story. No specifics, right? So we're, you know, one of the things I do is I try to go back and forth with some freelancers on whether I can sort of craft this pitch into something that we're going to like, and something that, you know, BuzzFeed readers are going to want to look. And I want to talk about that a little bit more later during Q&A about how our readership is a little bit different than they say something like the Washington Post, where you know, we're considered the millennial readership, like 18 to 35, where people really want to have interest in the world, and not just from a policy standpoint, but from the human interest standpoint as well. So I hope to discuss a lot of that with you later.
Great. Stand here or at the podium?
Well, Anup, why don't you slide?
Oh, that's right. All right, so I'm not going to talk about shaping and pitching really so much, but we can later, clearly. I just wanted to talk, I don't really need this, do I?
We're actually recording, so if you could use.
Is that better?
Yeah,
okay.
thank you.
So I was going to talk a little bit about investigative journalism, and about sort of about how you go about doing it when you're not really sure how to get started doing it. So I think that any journalism worth doing is going to be investigative in nature, whether you're writing a profile and searching out some deeper truth about someone, or whether you're looking for evidence of government malfeasance or something. You're always, you know, if you're not trying to get at something that is not accessible to the rest of the public, then sort of why do it? Sure. Can you hear me now? All right. Sorry about that. Do I need to start all over again? And so, but there are many ways to do that. I think there's a perception that all investigative journalism is sort of banging phones and yelling at government officials to tell me what the fuck I want or something like that. And it's really, it's much more delicate than that. And a lot of it is based on, I mean, there is a lot based on building trust with sources, but there's a lot on and in the national security realm, of course, it's having sources that trust that you are not going to reveal their names or identities in a way that could land them in trouble or land them in jail, but also building trust with sources of people who aren't used to dealing with journalists at all, convincing them to, you know, give you the passwords to their phone so you can look in old messages. So I will talk a little bit about a piece that I have running in the magazine on Monday that just was finished this week, and is about some of the issues I think you all were discussing yesterday about refugees. Also gets back to what Anup was just mentioning. So, you know, this summer, in the middle of the summer, as the refugee crisis in Europe was happening, it seemed to me that there was no one had done a story that took a single refugee and followed, sort of tracked their journey all the way from displacement to Europe, and had done so in a way that was, how we at the New Yorker try and tell stories in a sort of cinematic, long-winded, overly way. And so I convinced this, and also I kind of came from more traditional foreign correspondence, going places, looking for stories there, looking for sort of angles. And now at the New Yorker, just because of the luxury of time, really, have been able to sink in, writing 2, 3, 4, sometimes stories a year. It just kind of gives you a different metric and approach to what seems like a story worth investigating and how you go about doing it. But going back to this refugee story, so I eventually found this refugee, this young man who was a former law school student who was in Sweden, and began through friends convincing him that he should tell his story. Now, his idea of telling his story initially was through WhatsApp with a bunch of people, with some English speakers, some Arabic speakers on the message, him telling me parts of the story. There was never a translator there when the message came in, so then he would send me this long bit of text. I would put it into Google Translate and be like, all right, I think I understand it. Go back and be like, okay, so this is what happened, blah, 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 blah. Clearly, there's no way that's going to fit for a 9,000-word New Yorker story. So I was in Sweden on another piece and decided that it was smart to try and go and just meet this guy and try and build some rapport. And so I went and spent the day with him in Gothenburg. I had 6 hours from the time that my train arrived till the time that I had to get back on the train to go back to Stockholm, and thought that in those 6 hours, he said, I've got this English-speaking friend, a dentist who will be with us all day. We'll be able to, go through my whole story. Of course, we get there, and the dentist English, it's good enough to buy a cup of coffee. It's not good enough to sink into sort of details of, what made you decide to leave? What do your family think? And so part of initially, but what that did was just spending time with him face to face allowed us to have some trust. And here's the thing: is that everyone, you have to sort of be many things to multiple people, and that's not that, and do it in a way that is genuine and sincere. People, sources, everyone will sort of knows if you're, trying to con them, trying to pretend like you're something you're not. But you've got some connection to everybody. So with this guy, we quickly established that both of us were fans of English Premier League soccer, which is just the greatest sort of entree into all people around the world. If you're not a soccer fan now, you should become one. But so that was with him. But then as I was speaking to, there was a woman who was on his journey who I had to sort of, she didn't care about soccer. There's no reason to emphasize that. She was an English teacher. So then you could talk about, she traveled with her 4-year-old son. So at that point, then I'm emphasizing the fact that I'm a father and I have a 4-year-old son. So you sort of, you find those bonds and those ways to convince people that you are telling their story. And eventually, this young Syrian law school student, convinced us, or we convinced him to kind of do something that seemed ridiculous in the beginning, which is, give us your Facebook password and username so we can look in and find the old messages that you were sending family over the course of your journey. And those old messages, now you've got like a real-time voice filling in the story. So it's not just him saying, yeah, when we were stuck at that point in the trip, I was really scared and I didn't think we were going to make it. Now you've got him sending his mother or his sister-in-law messages saying, I'm going to kill myself. This sucks. Like I left such a good, like my situation in Syria doesn't seem so bad right now when I'm realizing that I've been sitting in Turkey for the past 6 months. And now you've got like real despair and dread. So, but I think that, there are a lot of ways to do that. And this story in the end is, it is an investigative story because we eventually convinced him to give us the, who were the smugglers that were letting you in. We eventually tracked down the smugglers, figured out how they do their business. How do they make their money? There's this Syrian guy who runs he runs his Facebook page, and he is like a real-time Harriet Tubman. This guy has a phone. He has his own channel on this app, and Syrians call him from Europe at all hours and say, I'm at the border, here's my coordinates, send them a dropped pin, and he then sends them annotated maps of how to get around the border, where the border guards are based on, it's like Waze, and he's got all this real-time information coming in. So in that sense, we've been able, I think, to sort of lift the veil on how the whole thing works, add some human element or human interest element to it. And keep it from being kind of a interesting but dry investigative piece. So we can talk more afterwards.
It's like musical chair. So before I start talking about Retro Report, I wanted to tell you guys that so I worked at 60 Minutes for 15 years and traveled the world and worked on all sorts of stories. But my most defining experience was right when I graduated from college. I had a really small fellowship and I made a short film in Northern Ireland. And it was different from all of your projects because it was really bad. But I still today, 20-something years later, think of that experience. And I learn more doing that and I draw on that more. So I hope you guys realize how lucky you are to have finished these projects. So Retro Report is a nonprofit news organization. Sarah described it well. We produce short documentaries or long form digital documentaries, depending on your perspective, 10 to 14 minute videos. And the premise is to look back and re-report and re-examine old news stories, and most importantly for us, how they continue to impact today. What we got wrong, what we didn't get wrong, what we can know, the mistakes that were made. Sarah talked a lot about the population bomb stories, you get that, but we're really generalists. So I have a little less than a minute long video that shows you the kind of things we do, if we can get it to play.
Katrina had built into a dangerous Category 5 hurricane barreling towards New Orleans.
We didn't have an instruction book to tell us how to do this. He's the sweetest killer whale known to man.
In the movie, he jumps to freedom. But what about in real life?
Scientists in Scotland had successfully cloned a sheep.
People began to say, well, couldn't we do this with humans? People tended to assume that this would happen.
An 81-year-old woman has sued McDonald's, claiming their coffee was too hot.
Once everybody decides what is true about something, how do you deal with the fact that they might be wrong?
Okay. Okay. So that gives you a little bit of sense of the kind of things that we do. But we have about 20 reporters on staff, reporters, producers, and we do work with freelancers. So we get a lot of proposals, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I look for in those proposals, because you guys are all going to start thinking that way, the kind of proposals you want to write. And I think that the things that I look for translate medium and form, right? So you could be working on a long form magazine piece, you could be working on a feature length doc, you could be working on a 10 to 14 minute digital documentary, and they're all kind of the same things. Of course, the most important thing is the idea, but also knowing the place that you're pitching, right? So we care a lot about how history is impacting today. So if you get a pitch that is only historical, or you get a pitch that doesn't actually fully bring you to today, clearly that's not the kind of story that we would be interested in. One of the first pieces that we did that will give you a sense of the breadth is on the so-called crack baby epidemic in the 1980s. So there were all these stories, there was going to be this generation of crack babies damaged like any, beyond repair, that social services would be overwhelmed. Well, here we are all these years later, and what happened? And we went back and found that a lot of the hysterical coverage was based on one study of 23 babies, and the researcher didn't control for things like maternal lifestyle and alcohol, and over time it became clear that these effects weren't as devastated as everyone had feared. And of course, the initial policy response was to incarcerate pregnant women who had cocaine in their bloodstream. So this was the perfect story for us because it was hyped in the press, and there was all these coverage of people saying this is the end of the world as we know it. But what really drove it home was in the last few years, we started to see stories about oxytots and meth babies. And it was the same kind of hysterical coverage. And a lot of them, they would talk about the crack baby epidemic, but they would miss the part that actually over 30 years, all the science had shown that it wasn't as devastating as we'd feared. So for us, we're also judging and reporting on the impact. And it takes a lot of time to really think through what's a story that has that kind of breadth. And, it's a different form of investigative reporting, but it is still judging the impact of a seminal moment and how we keep making the same mistakes. And then the second part, of course, is also really obvious, but important to think about is storytelling, how you even write your pitch and how you will convey information. Certainly on the web, if you want to keep somebody watching a 14, 15-minute video, it has to be really compelling and really well done. And I think our story this week, which was on the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, and you guys should all go watch it, is a good example of it. It was 15 minutes, and it's the story of the first 7 are basically backstory. The story of the dictatorship in Argentina from 1976 to 83, and this one woman whose daughter disappears, and she realizes she's pregnant, and she spent the next nearly 40 years searching for her missing grandchild. And the way the producer structured the story is the first story is all backstory, and you kind of think, well, maybe it's ending, and then you meet the grandson, and he just finds out that he was adopted, and he doesn't know, and he goes and gets his blood test, and all of a sudden, and you know it as a viewer, but to see that moment where they're reunited is just really, you can't watch it without crying because it's so moving, and I think tells you more about the conflict and about the search for, closure in all these cases. And also the deeper story, which is also always important to be thinking about. So this woman, this grandmother has called always for the prosecution of these families who adopted these children. But now she's calling for the prosecution of her grandson's adopted parents whom he loves, right? So it's that conflict when the political becomes personal and how she navigates that line. And I think everyone can relate to it. And that's, a 15-minute video, and we beat out all the other, fashion and recipe videos and cat videos. But I think a human rights video about Argentina doing that well is a testament to the way that story was told. So those are the things to think about, and I think put a lot of work into the way you're thinking of shaping a story, reporting a story, and also knowing when to walk away. We spent a lot of time on a mad cow disease story. We're convinced it's the perfect retro report. We were all going to die from eating hamburgers, and we didn't, right? But we couldn't really figure out where it went after you said we didn't, right? The science is still confusing and gray, and what does it mean? And it wasn't enough. And that poor producer spent, weeks and weeks. And finally said, you know what, I don't really have that much to say. So it's important to know when to walk away as much as when to, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, so there you go.
Hi, I guess I should tell you a little bit about myself. Lauren kind of hinted at my background. I did a lot of things before. I'm a high school dropout. I worked as a garbage man, hay baler, watermelon picker before I went to school and got a degree in journalism when I was 30. And then just kind of kept going and never looked back until about 98 and I worked as a picture editor, a photographer, director of photography at papers in Florida and New England, Alaska. In 98, I went to teach at Syracuse University, and I wound up being there for 7 years, and it was the longest I'd ever been anywhere, because in the journalism world, you're often moving around, and it was an incredible experience. But I turned 50, and I had what I like to call my first midlife crisis, and I quit my job and sold my house and decided to drive around the country for a year and see family and friends. And then I decided, if I'm going to do that, I need to have my own documentary project. And I knew I'd been really wanting to play with audio, which I'd been playing with, but I wanted to immerse myself in it. So I decided to do a project using audio and still photography and documenting barbecue in America. Sounds like a funny thing to do, and it is kind of a funny thing to do, but it was also fun. And I just kind of taught myself audio along the way and multimedia producing. And now I've gotten into video and everything as well, but most of the stuff for my project has all been still photography and audio. So I'm going to really talk to you today about audio and just a few things to keep in mind, a few things that I learned. Most of the pieces, like you talk about 15-minute pieces, that's kind of long for on the web. Now, if it's good, it's all dependent on how good it is. But when I was starting to do the research on this, and I'm reading what what previous researchers have said, and they say that most people's attention span is about 4 minutes for one of these multimedia pieces. 4 minutes, that's not a lot of time. And I tried, so that was kind of what I had for my window, what I was looking to do. But I was really trying to keep it more down to 3 minutes. So you need to understand that once you introduce audio, audio rules. You've really got to have good audio first. And visual people, particularly still photographers who get into multimedia, some of them resent that. What do you mean audio rules? I'm a photographer. My picture should. But you really got to have a good, strong narrative. And you've got to have people with you, because people will sit through a piece that has good audio and kind of average or bad pictures. Much more likely to sit through a piece than to have a piece that has really good images but terrible audio. You just can't, they can't stand it. So the other thing too is in terms of the time, like I mentioned before, people might sit through 8, 9, 4-minute pieces, 3-minute pieces, but they're not even going to sit through 1 10-minute piece often. So because it's always a matter of time. So there's a couple things I'm gonna explain to you. Just take me right to
them, or do you want?
just the first one.
Okay, so that one. Or this one. Yeah. Left side here. Let's make this full screen. So this one. Or
Okay, so this is, I'm just going to show you a couple of pieces from my project, and I've got something else I'm going to show you. But because of the time factor, like, you have to know what story it is you want to tell. So there was a couple of times when, and this happened early on, and it was a really good experience for me, where I knew there was just this little side element of a story, and it was really very interesting, and I wanted to tell that story. So often I would edit that part first, and I'm editing the audio. I don't even look at, I mean, I look at the images, but I edit for audio first and get my piece to the length I want it, and I think how I'm going to fill in the visuals. So for example, I'll show you. So one of the first pieces I did was on this guy. A friend of mine told me about this guy who sells barbecue in Vermont out of an old school bus, and he had a pet pot-bellied pig walking around the place. So I'm editing that pig story first, or that pig part of it, because that was just so interesting to me. And then I got to this point, and I realized how long it was just editing this. And I realized I don't have enough time to tell the rest of the story if I'm going to keep under that window. So that's early on, it gave me a whole idea of incorporating sidebars, which is, you know, what's done all the time in print journalism, has been done forever, but I wasn't thinking about that at first. So, and that's helped me since. So I'm just going to show you this one and another one of my projects. I don't know what happened in your visuals.
That's a CJ. CJ, that's my pop better pig. So
interesting.
It works just with the eye.
Yeah, I thought it was.
Yeah.
I thought it was on purpose.
No.
That's interesting. It must be something with the.
Maybe don't go.
Let's try it one more. Yeah, maybe we won't go full screen. Try one more time.
Try reloading it.
Yeah.
Okay.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's try one more time. Cross your fingers. Now loading. Third time's a charm, maybe?
Can't hurt.
Okay. No.
Did you do a hard refresh?
I thought it did. Pretty sure I did.
Yeah, just drag that out. Try dragging that out. Yeah.
Let's see what this.
It's
I think it's okay.
It may be loaded.
Should I just load?
Vimeo servers are like notorious for taking too long.
But even if I did this, it should still do the same thing, right? If we're just loading, should we wait for it to load?
Maybe if you try scrubbing ahead a little bit, maybe it'll rush up the process.
This is like the modern equivalent of like blowing into your Nintendo. Like maybe try scrubbing and then going back.
Yeah, no image. Is it?
There you go, it's loading.
Yeah, but there's no image.
Oh.
That's what's so odd.
You can just open it up within the video link.
Okay.
It might just be something with the embed.
Great idea. Thank you. Teamwork. Cross- Okay.
I wonder if it's a Vimeo issue today.
Yes, that's.
We have all the experts though, so I'm sure you'll see.
Yeah, really. There's a group of individuals who want to.
Let's see.
And did you have Sean Gallagher's thing loaded too?
Yeah,
His
that
website?
one is right here. So.
Why don't we play?
Why don't we try watching that? Yeah, let's try looking at.
Okay, so here's a separate thing. You guys are you guys are welcome to go on the site, my site, www.bbqpilgrim.com, and just see what I see, see what I was talking about, and maybe we'll be able to still see it later.
Yeah,
but the main thing is I wanted to get that idea across to you about having a sidebar. Like if there's a really interesting part of it, edit that part of it, because I mean, when I edit audio, I tend to work in terms of much like I would a story. You know, the most important thing I have to decide, and I decide this by the audio, this by the soundbite itself. I want to know how am I going to start it, how am I going to end it, and then I fill in the middle. So I want to know what the beginning is. I want the beginning to have, you know, really kind of grab people and maybe pique their curiosity. Huh? What's this about? What's about to come? And I want to end it on a nice statement. And then I kind of fill in between. So sometimes those in-betweens, though, like I said, with these sidebars, like this little potbelly pig, I got to hear the story about this pig. So, like I said, that fortunately, early on in my project gave me the idea of utilizing sidebars. And I think it really helped me a lot later on. So now this is something I'm going to show you. This is another thing I think is very important for you guys to be thinking about as you're going out there. It's great that you're doing these projects, but you want to see who's going to run these projects, who's going to, you know, who's going to publish them, who's going to get the word out there. You want to, you know, the whole purpose of doing a story, obviously, is to show it. Well, this is something I saw a guy named Sean Gallagher, who's often supported by the Pulitzer Center. You guys, he's done wonderful projects with them. First time I saw this project, I just thought it was genius. And the way he handled, very simply and effectively, a way to reach two audiences at once. So he does this thing that when he has somebody that's speaking Chinese, he has English subtitles. And when he has somebody that's speaking English, he has Chinese subtitles. My goodness, it was like when I said it's so simple and it's so effective. And believe me, if you are pitching a story to different publications, different websites, everybody's wondering how to reach multiple audience. So if you have that ability to bring that into your pieces, that really, I think, opens up your effectiveness and how they're going to view you as a potential continuing contributor. So let's try this. Whoops.
And let's make this large. See if this one works. It's also Vimeo.
Yeah.
Well, believe me, it's very interesting.
It's loading. It's loading. It's loading. What we might be able to do, let's just check to see if this one's loaded. Yeah, it's awesome audio, but there's no video.
I was just going to make a joke saying, aren't you glad?
You can see what happened to your side pages. Really zoom in while we're
There we go.
It's gonna buffer it.
Yeah. Lauren, turn off HD.
Okay. Turning off HD. You guys are a very patient bunch. I appreciate it.
HD.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
The Chinese alligator is one of the most threatened species in China.
Inhabiting the ponds, streams and lakes of the Yangtze River, the country's only crocodilian has come under threat as China's rush to develop pushes it closer to the brink of extinction.
在过去几个世纪，扬子鳄的这个数量下降非常非常的这个可怕。那么在1998年的这个调查当中，就发现我们野生的扬子鳄只剩了120头。那么过去已经是上万头，或者说几百万头这样的这个数量级的这个状况。那么这个下降的这个主要的原因，在50、60年代，出现大量的这个围湖造田，还有就是把这个物种作为一个害兽，因为他们认为是一个竞争性的一个物种，比如养了鱼啊的其他的这些水生生物可能会被这个扬子鳄吃掉。另外呢，可能就是人口增加的越来越多，所以有扬子鳄的地方，他们的栖息地一个是变成农田，另外呢，人越来越多，肯定也不喜欢旁边有这么一个危险的一个物种存在。
The Anhui Research Center for Alligator Reproduction in central China is on the forefront of what is now an effort to save the Chinese alligator. Its state-sponsored captive breeding program has seen a rapid increase in the number of Chinese alligators. Concerns remain, however, for the wild populations.
所以从那以后，当然从70、80年代，我们国家国家政府就已经意识到这个物种数量已经非常濒危，所以建立了安徽扬子鳄保护区和这个繁殖中心，那么开始了大量的繁殖工作。那么这个繁殖工作也非常非常成功，到现在刚开始可能是抓了200头左右，那么现在已经到了1万头，1万多头。所以人工繁殖技术已经是不存在问题了，但是野外的这个状况仍然是没有太多的这个改变。
Xie Yan is one of a small and concerned group who are behind the current push to conserve the remaining Chinese alligators. On visiting the breeding center in Anhui, she joins local staff.
So it's seamless.
So anyway, again, that's something you can go back to and view on the Pulitzer site or on Sean Gallagher's site. But again, it's just something for you to think about, and it puts bullets in your weapons arsenal in terms of, when I mean weapons arsenal in terms of getting jobs and getting hired. That's something that's going to be of a lot of interest to a lot of people. So I guess now we have more time for Q&A.
I'll take that quick. Does anybody have a question to start? Oh, right here.
Where's it? Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was just thinking as I'm sitting listening that a lot of people in this room are really interested in sitting where you guys are and having these experiences, being able to work around the world. And for many of us, as you know, like media is changing. We don't exactly know. The landscape isn't the same as it used to be. So what advice do you have for what you would do if you were early in your career to be able to do the work that you do today?
You want to start, Mark?
I'll start. I mean, I think you're doing it. You need to be in this room, for you guys either just out of school or still some not having graduated, to be starting off your career, having done stories, national or international stories. It's such a much bigger head start than I ever had. I mean, that's huge. So you should all be very proud of yourselves. I mean, I think that says a lot and it's going to say a lot on your resume, and other people are going to recognize that.
Yeah, no, I would, excuse me, I would second that. I mean, I think that the model of starting as a cub reporter and working your way up, I don't see it. I mean, it's a pretty unsustainable model at this point. So I think that just exactly the same thing. The way to do it is to be going places, reporting stories, whether it's on someone else's dime or whether even sometimes in the beginning it's on your own dime. But you've got to, you have to sort of, I feel like, and Anup could speak to this as well, but I feel like you have a lot more traction if you are in country X and you say, I mean, no one is going to hire you to go to Myanmar and to cover the elections. But if you happen to be in India or someplace and you say, there's this interesting story that I've been tracking from here, and you lay it out, like it's an hour-long flight, it's $150, I can get there and I can go spend 2 days and report that story. All of a sudden now, you've shown that editor that you're committed, you're already there, you're ready to do the legwork, you've already thought about the logistics, you've already told them how much it's going to cost, which is a huge thing. And your hands are already dirty. So the fact that you're already out in the field just gives you a massive leg up in terms of pitching. And but you're right, it's a crowded field. And so how do you stand out? Stand out by writing not more stories, because people don't really count the number of stories, but better stories, ones that have better character development or show that you spent an extra 3 days investigating, some issue rather than just kind of having thought, I've got enough at this point. So. But again, I think that you're starting on the right track.
Nick, maybe before we leave you, give us an example. What was a breakthrough pitch and story for you early on?
Well, no doubt. I mean, the breakthrough. So I, in grad school, had an opportunity to go spend the summer of 2004 studying at Tehran University, learning Farsi at the University of Tehran. So I went as a student on a student visa, but knew from the minute, knew that I wanted to try and somehow squeeze some journalism out of that. So that gave me, I came back and at that point, we were gangbusters in Iraq and it looked like we were going to Iran next. And it was kind of a night, I could come back to DC and write a couple of stories that were, I thought at least I had some ground knowledge of what was going on in Iran. I don't think anyone read those stories, but it gave you a little bit of confidence. So I proposed, the biggest pitch was a fellowship proposal I wrote to actually an office that's here in this same floor, the Institute of Current World Affairs. And I proposed that I wanted to go and spend 2 years in Iran. And my whole pitch was that, I'm not a journalist. I don't really know anything about journalism, but I just spent the summer in Iran. I have some experience. I think that I can get a visa for 2 years. And, I'm sort of wild-eyed, eager and ready to do this. And so I got that fellowship. And then I got the fellowship and then I couldn't get into Iran. So I went back to them. I wanted to do something about identity politics in Iran. And I went back to them and I said, there's this country next door, Pakistan. They have some messed up identity issues. Could I possibly go there and do my 2 years there? And went. And so sort of that was the experience, getting, but it was much like you have with your Pulitzer fellowships. Then I had 2 years to go and just figure out how to be a journalist. And it was about a year left in that fellowship. I had learned about this. I picked up this story of what was happening inside the Pakistani Taliban and wrote a 600-word pitch to the New York Times Magazine. Again, I'm already here. It's not going to cost me that much. I can do it. And they assigned that story, and that was kind of that was my mantra.
I couldn't agree with that more. I think one of the things I keep telling, like when I go back to Columbia, which is my alma mater, I keep telling students the most important thing is like knowing how to report. I know that the journalism is changing so quickly, and when I was in grad school, 2007, my big fear was, oh my God, I have to go back to Nepal, which is where I came from to study here, and I was like, everything was changing so quickly. It was like, okay, I need to learn how to do video. I need to learn how to do audio, photos. I need to write. And that sort of, I realized halfway through the year, it put me in this position where I wasn't really good at anything, but I could do everything, right? And soon enough, I was just like, okay, I think I've always wanted to be a foreign correspondent. So I started focusing more on international reporting classes. So one thing, if there's one thing that sort of carried me along, over the last 6-7 years, is knowing how to report. I can go to a country, I can report for a newspaper, I can write a story, and that's the most important thing, is you have to know how to tell a story. Other thing is what Nick said. Right now, if you're traveling, you're in a country, make sure you know the kind of stories that you want to pitch. Make sure you know what you're talking about and have a really good grasp of what is it that you want to do, rather than putting a very broad sort of, oh, I'm going to be in India and I want to cover the elections, or I want to be in this country and do X. have a very specific, like, I think the Pulitzer model is great because, you know, they ask you to do 150 to 200 word pitch, which is perfect. You know, I don't want to read a long email. I want like a graph of what you want to do. And I think a lot of publishers now, especially with like, you know, the online sort of field is growing so quickly, you don't have to worry about having a byline in the Times or the Post, or, you know, you can write for Vice, you can write for BuzzFeed, and, you know, those stories are shared and read by more people than, you know, you've ever imagined. So I'm just continuing encouraging that, focusing on reporting.
And I just want to elaborate on the part about honing your craft. That it's important to know how to do all sorts of different things in this day and age, but it's also more important to figure out what your form is, right? Because writing a magazine piece is very different from making a documentary, and that's very different from audio storytelling, right? They're all different types of storytelling. And I think, like any craft, the more you do it, right, you look back at your early drafts and you grow and you get better and better and better. So while it's important to have some basic multimedia skills, I think pick the area that you love and focus and watch people too. I mean, I agree you need to be out there, but I also think what I learned the most was from working with really talented producers or filmmakers or reporters, right, and watching them. So even if you can't work with them directly, if you're watching them work and really understanding the decisions they make.
Thank you.
You have the microphone right behind you.
Oh, perfect. Okay, hi, my name is Kyra, and I have a question for each of you, and I hope they're not too long. For Kyra, can you talk about the challenges of the nonprofit model reporting that you use?
Yes.
For Nick, what's the secret sauce to getting a story run in the New Yorker? For Anup, recently I had an experience with AJ Plus where a story I did for Pulitzer was considered a bit too newsy for their millennial audience, and I realized that there was an increasing trend in journalism, BuzzFeed among those, Vice, etc., to cater to this audience, and in many ways to change the tone and substance of the story to reach this millennial audience. Can you speak to how to maintain the integrity of the story and still reach this audience? And for Mark, can you speak about your challenges about starting journalism at a later point in your life, and how you meet your financial needs like retirement, healthcare, and things that, for example, I'm starting to worry about right now?
Well, so I left 60 Minutes to build Retro Report, and one of the reasons I left is I was really excited and interested in the nonprofit model. That there is something, we're really lucky. We spend months and months and months reporting stories, and we're
Kyra, really quick, can you turn it back on? I just want you to, I want them to be able to hear you on the video. Yeah, so the red light is good.
Hello.
That's good, so leave it there. Thank you.
So the nonprofit model is really great for doing work that you care about and being able to spend the time and you know, if the nonprofit shares your mission, right? But
sorry. Yeah. Technical difficulties aside, apologies.
But you know, how to keep that nonprofit sustaining, how to grow as a nonprofit. I mean, you know, we're a digital first company. That was really important to us. We're building an archive of modern news events. We want it to be free for people to interact with, you know, for years and years to come. That's part of our mission. But that's different from the daily news model, right? And we may be often the most trafficked video on the New York Times website, but what does that mean in terms of sustaining yourself as an organization? And I think we're in a tricky time where as the for-profit journalism is struggling, hopefully nonprofits can jump in to fill the gap a little bit.
So I couldn't really, you know, speak to the AJ Plus or Vice or something, but, you know, I can speak about a very specific thing on how BuzzFeed does these. Obviously, I mean, AJ Plus is a very sort of like Facebook-centric audience, so I'm sure, like, you know, their way of handling the story is very different. But one of the things, so it's gonna be like, I'm like BuzzFeed PR right now. So BuzzFeed is basically like, you know, people see BuzzFeed as like, oh, the site that does cat videos, right? I still get it from so many people. BuzzFeed has the buzz arm, and then it has the news arm, and then it has the life arm. And, you know, if you're on Facebook, you'll notice a lot of these like amazing videos about cooking in like 30 seconds, or, you know, Americans try Indian food for the first time, see their reaction. That's all like buzz and life and that sort of stuff. I work for the news division, and there are about 300 people now, including the foreign section, which has correspondents at least in like 7, 8 countries. We just hired like someone in Senegal, and now like a national security reporter. Our goal is to do stories that that tell a story, obviously, but also doesn't quite like, we don't want people to dumb it down for like that millennial audience kind of a thing, but we want it to be very sort of gripping. And I think that's, that happens at the Washington Post too. When I was at the Post, we weren't really like, into stories where like the nut graph was like 5th paragraph down. We wanted people to like, say what was happening right up top. And I think BuzzFeed model is almost, the same. We do encourage people to think about headlines a lot because headlines is very important. So that's where we do a lot of back and forth, whether it is with our correspondents or with the freelancers that I work in. But never do we say, we want you to do this, or, we want you to do that. But we will have suggestions on how to sort of make it more colorful, bring some characters higher up, or, get rid of a lot of the sort of Wikipedia sort of like knowledge reference that we don't need in that story. Because, I mean, in a video, as Mark said before, 3 to 4 minutes, print story, we get metrics on how far down people read. So we have to be careful about what's on the top of the story. If you're looking at it as an editor, when you scroll, you will see 100% of people read up to here. Then 83% people read through here, and then 67. So by the time 3 scrolls, imagine on your laptop, you're already losing readers. So how do you try to keep your readers up there? So I mean, as an editor, our job is to make sure it's tight, it's gripping, and it's sort of like character and energy driven.
So 3 things just to pick up on the last sort of series of the things we were talking about. And then I'll go to the secret sauce question. You are sort of, remember that you are in some ways competing to try and stand out from the crowd and convince editors. So it really helps to know what else is out there. So if you're trying to pitch a story, if you're in India and you're trying to convince Anup to pay for your plane ticket to go to Myanmar, you've got to be able to say, the coverage so far that's been done in the New York Times or the Washington Post or wherever has been this. What I propose to do is different in this such and such a way. So that's one thing. The other thing is that as you're reading, as you're finding stories that you like, and you're not sure why you like them, but you read a story, it's either a newspaper story, magazine story, or it's a documentary. I know that terrain less well, but or not at all. But when you see something you like, often stop and try and break it down. Try and figure out why it works. I actually have done this with Kyra's husband's stories for years. Her husband is David Grand, who was the sort of maestro of the New Yorker. And when I first started, I would just take his stories and read them and deconstruct them and figure out like, how did he do it? What does this paragraph do? This paragraph this is the character paragraph. This is and it almost in a way at the end, it makes it a little bit easier to see how he pulled it all together. But it also kind of makes it, you realize that, okay, this is in some ways, and what another New Yorker writer, so you call it, had said at some point, that this is really paint by numbers. You try to kind of demystify the process. So I think that's something really helpful to do as an exercise as well. And just the third thing is in terms of learning at this range, you do one thing well, and you're going to be successful at it. And whether it's writing magazine stories or making documentaries or as an editor, there's a question, well, like, does anyone pay for magazines anymore? You're right, the pool is smaller and smaller and smaller, but if you do it well, you'll find success. Now, the question of the secret sauce, was your question more, how do you, because convincing the New Yorker to commission a story and then turning it in and having it run in timely fashion are 2 very different things. Okay, so, I mean, I had been pitching the magazine for 6-7 years probably before they finally assigned the first story. The first story that was assigned was a sort of an evergreen feature about a court martial in which a guy was tried 3 times for murder. It was a typical twisty New Yorker story in which you could then delve into the military justice system. While I was reporting that, the Bin Laden raid happened, and I went back to them and said, actually, I have an incredible source, and I can do this story in a way that no one else will be able to do this story. And that story was assigned within 5 minutes of me sending that email saying I just left lunch with this person, and he's going to talk to me. That story was assigned, and then I filed the story on a Friday, and it appeared the following Friday. Or it appeared the following 10 days later in print. It's never happened again. So it really kind of depends on the subject matter. But I mean, a good pitch is going to get you in the door. Some name recognition, persistence, just having a track record in which you can point to other stories. But I also know there are some writers there who, I think Sarah Stillman, who's done some amazing work for the magazine for years, had no record of stories, no bylines really before that at all, and now has won, I think, 2 or 3 national magazine awards in the past couple of years. So there are many ways, I think, to think at.
As for working towards financial security, I guess the best advice I could give you is don't do what I did. Because I never really thought about it. I got into it late. Like I said, I didn't graduate from undergraduate school until I was 30, and then I started working right away. But I was working for, everything I'd done, I just did. Like I'd do watermelon picking for a while and hay baling. Did airline catering, and I never really thought about, well, the next job will come along and something will come. And then when I got into journalism, I started, my first paper was a New York Times owned paper, and I used to get New York Times stock at the end of every year and get it at a discount. I should have been putting that away. I cashed it in as soon as I got it, because it already came with a 15%, discount. So I'm already getting my 15% on it, and I'm buying camera equipment because I'm a photographer, and that's what it takes. So, and I kind of kept on doing that, and then really the only thing I ever did, the only investment I ever made that paid off was the house I got in Syracuse when I moved to Syracuse to teach. But when I quit my job, the first thing I did was sell my house. That's what enabled me to go travel around the country. So, the other thing too is when I sold my house, the first thing I did was pay off all my bills. I was debt free for the first time in 20 years. And to me, that was liberating. I know a more responsible person might have said, well, how can I invest some of this money? I'm thinking, let's go travel around and have some fun. So I don't recommend that. I think you want to be thinking about just putting away. It's that old model, and it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to sustain that now, because if you put money in a bank, you get 0 point nothing interest. So, but you got to think of some type of investment strategies for yourself. And then I would say the other thing I would tell you is, once you're at a comfortable spot, and particularly if you're at a spot where you think you're going to be, buy a home. It really is one of the easiest one for any of us to do, because we're going to have to be paying that money out for rent anyway. And at least then you're getting some equity. And at the end of the year, the tax breaks you get is, which, whenever I got those, I pissed those away too. But so I would always get a lot of money when, at the end of every year when I had a house. So anyway, don't do the things I do. Start saving, start putting some money away.
One of the things, like as students or sort of like graduates, we were like getting grants to go out and reporting.
Can you get, sorry.
I can't stress how important it is to sort of pitch different kind of stories to different publications. I've seen a lot of friends do it. I know, if you're interested in doing one big long form stuff for New Yorker, I think it pays quite well, so you're fine. But if you're doing you could do a story for BuzzFeed, you could do it for AZ Plus. Just be versatile and know that you can pitch different ideas. If you're spending 10 days in a country, you can do 3 stories, and that's what I've always done with the Pulitzer grant stuff, is do multiple different stories, pitch to different people, so you're making the best out of your stuff.
I have a question.
One more to add to that, and when you talk about pitching different stories, think about completely different stories. I remember when I was a student at the University of Florida, an undergraduate student, we had these alumni, this couple that came in, a writer and a photographer couple. And they would explain how when they go someplace to do a story, say they're doing a news story, they'd work together on that. But then during that same trip, they would go around to get information about the architecture and do a story for an architecture magazine. They would connect with chefs and different restaurants and do something for a food magazine. And then you're just building your contact list, and wherever you go, these are things that have interest now all over. So, it's not just this way. You're not kind of doing 3 different news stories, because then you can get some resentment from the editors. Well, why didn't you give me this piece? So it's just something to think about. Really broaden the types of stories you do.
You guys have spoken a little bit about writing pitches. I was curious, when a journalist is like in the room with an editor and they're trying to convince them about their pitch, kind of what is it that you can say, or is it something that you really can't say and you just have to show when you're pitching to an editor? Maybe if the editors want to start with this one. Thank you.
Well, so again, I mentioned we spend months and months on stories, so, and we spend a lot of money on them. So our process is, you're usually a freelancer is invited to submit a pitch, although we would take a pitch from an outside person who's not invited, and we do get them unsolicited pitches, but usually you're invited to submit a pitch. And then if I like the pitch, then we would have a meeting. But the meeting is really to make sure that you've thought through, that you kind of get our form to the point of knowing the place, right? So if somebody comes to a meeting and says, I watched 20 retro reports and the ones I love best are these, and this is how my piece will be different, this is how it'll be similar, this is my voice, this is what I want to do with it. That's what I want to hear, right? I don't want them all to be the same, but I want to understand that they know what we're doing is different. It's not a 60 minutes piece. It's not a feature-length doc. So that's what I'm looking for. If you're in the meeting, I like the idea enough that I can see it happening, and then I want to know that you get who we are and what we're doing. Great advice.
I think it's like pretty simple for us. I mean, it all goes back to like, how much homework have you done on a specific pitch, like it's different between like, I guess it's similar for freelancers as well as correspondents, but with correspondents, they spend like weeks trying to, investigate something like, if you're doing a story on refugees, but you're trying to figure out a specific angle, like, they will come up with a list of sources in country X, country Y, the government people they're going to interview, security situation, how much we need to invest in terms of security and all of that stuff. And that sort of plays into a decision about whether we want to do something like that, or also like, if a competitor has already done it, or does it make sense to do that story right now. With freelancers, it's a little bit different. We're always like, interested in doing something new. I had this like pitch from Jerusalem the other day. Everybody was pitching. I was like, oh, I want to write about the rising violence in Jerusalem. That sounds like anybody, like, what are you going to do about it, right? So somebody pitched a really interesting story about the use of social media, like Snapchat specifically, about how people were playing Snapchat and how that was like, factoring this violence, or like how people were using it. And that was a very fascinating pitch. It was like 2 paragraphs, and it's like, great, it's unique. The person gets it, that BuzzFeed audience is into sort of like, the social media thing, especially, and a lot of people are, Snapchat is like the second most widely used social media, app now. So we're like, sold.
Right. Just one more thing that I wanted to add, because it follows up on a question on the last panel a little bit, is when I left 60 Minutes to come to Retro Report, and I was the first person there, the very first thing I did was write our ethics and standard policy. And I have had to add to it and add to it and add to it. And now we actually always assign someone from our staff to work with the freelancer, because I'm so worried about it. I did grow up in the kind of news system, and so I took it for granted that people had the same kind of training that I had, and that's just not the case. So the other thing I really look for is people who understand the ethics and the people who are thinking about that. So that conversation before with everyone on the panel, these are the things that really matter. Now, part of it is, again, because we see ourselves as, we like to say, if reporting's the first draft, journalism's the first draft, if history were the second draft, right? So it really matters to us. We have fact checking that no television program actually has. We have a very, very arduous fact checking process. So we care a lot about getting it right. Everybody does, but I think we're really obsessive about it. And so that matters a lot to me too, that people get, signal in some way that they understand the complexities that are at play.
Thank you. Do we have more questions from the audience?
Yeah, sort of a question for the editors as well. I imagine you guys and editors at publications everywhere had your email accounts are just inundated by pitches all the time. And so I was wondering if you have just sort of any little bits of advice to aspiring journalists as like how we can make sure that our pitches actually get read.
For me, the subject line is very important in an email. Like, it's true, like, I was telling, like, I get like right now I'm getting like 3 pitches a day from Myanmar. And I think the subject line is sort of like the headline, right? That's what's going to make you click more. I know I'm like sounding very like, BuzzFeedy now, but that's really what's going to make you open. But I do, as an editor, I check like every single email that comes in my inbox. And I go through them and I actually discuss it with my editor in New York saying, what do you think about this? If it's like really, really bad, I don't bother to discuss with an editor. But if I like it and I feel like we need to hire that freelancer, then I'll say. But I think, again, it goes back to have a really like specific subject line about what, think about what your story is going to be. And then just have like 2 paragraphs on, what the story pitch is, how you're going to accomplish it. Just very specific, like research reported stuff. Don't write like a long sort of, list of things you want to do or like long background. Like, we don't need to know, like, there's been war going on since 1965 and all of that stuff, right? I just want very specific stuff.
So I usually, someone vets them and then they come to me. So I'm not the first I on them usually. And by the time she gives them to me, she's at least done some due diligence. So I trust her.
Well, so one thing that I've noticed is pick up the phone. Everybody emails. Yeah. There's this concern that you're gonna bother an editor, but it means so much more if you just sent an email. You give them some time, but like 6 hours later or the next day, call, follow up. Hey, I sent you a note yesterday. I just want to make sure you got it. Being able to match a voice with a face goes so far. And I think that it replaces, the question was like, what do you do when you get in the room with an editor? You're probably not going to pitch an editor face-to-face or freelancer. I think I've pitched, it doesn't work as well for me. I find it's easier for me to lay out the story on paper than it is for me to go in and pitch it in person. But picking up the phone, I think really I've had some great success. I actually had some really bizarre conversations. I remember one time I called from Pakistan, I called an editor at Vanity Fair who was maybe like the number 2 or number 3 person at Vanity Fair. And I called them and they picked up and I thought that they were the person, but they were actually like the assistant. And I was like, fuck, I can't believe I just got this person on the phone. I'm like pitching them and they're like, oh, this sounds amazing. And then he's like, yeah, just send it to my email. And it wasn't certainly the name that I thought it was. It was some assistant. But I mean, it's just really, you're now in that person's head. And so I think it makes a world of difference.
Did you get to the story too?
No, I did not get the story.
One thing, and I see it a lot of like, people do it these days. Do not tweet at me and say, do you want a story? Like, never do that. And don't write on Facebook either, right? Like, but I've also like seen a lot of people email and ask for coffee, and I welcome that. And I think that's a really good way of like maintaining a relationship. Have some good ideas in your head. You don't have to come up with like one specific story ideas, but ask for coffee. Like you're always learning from these editors anyway. Be interested in what their publication's about. Know what the kind of stories that they're publishing, and come up with a couple of good ideas and say, these are the sort of things that I've been interested in, and good luck to be in touch. Then you can email always again, right?
And to get, sorry, just one more quick thing about the emailing phone thing. This gets a little bit ahead of where we are in the conversation, but when you're reporting a story and you're beginning to figure out, you've sort of mapped out your constellation of who it is that you want to talk to, and you're sending emails, it's the easiest way to say, I don't want to talk to this person if you send them an email. So 3 things. Phone calls are, you don't have to catch them off guard, but you suddenly now you're in their space and you've caught their attention. Letters, I send letters to people's houses all the time. It's a way of, like, if I know the person doesn't want to talk to me, I'll send a letter to someone's house. Oftentimes, send it via FedEx, just 1 page, send a letter to their house. Now all of a sudden you're there. You're
Are they handwritten?
No, I type them out, but sign them and all that. Include a business card. Sometimes include a piece that again, finding your audience. I was trying to convince this Chicago detective who had 38 misconduct allegations against him and had this story I was working on most likely beaten a confession out of the guy that I was writing had been wrongfully convicted, who 6 months after my piece came out was pardoned and is now exonerated and a free man. So when I reached out to this detective originally, I emphasized that I came from a military family. I knew that I needed, now is the time to try and stress, but now is not the time to send him my most antagonize the government stories, but the ones to send him the sort of the good guys win-ish kind of stories. So I sent him a piece about the DEA busting some drug trafficker, arms trafficker. I emphasized the fact that I came from a military family. I knew that he had spent some time in the military as well. And he called me back the next day. So that's another thing. And then the third thing, of course, is just showing up at someone's door. It's so fun. It's nerve-wracking. You oftentimes get doors shut in your face, but approaching someone or showing up when they're giving a talk, if they've been avoiding you and showing up when they've been giving a talk and asking them afterwards, hey, I just traveled all the way from DC, where this happened in California a few months ago. I said, I just got off a 6-hour flight. Just give me a few minutes of your time. He said no, but it's a great scene in the piece because it just shows he's avoiding you sort of at all costs. So
that's a source, not an editor.
That's a source, yeah.
Don't
do
that. Or if you do show up with some loaf of bread or something.
I think Allison has a question.
Yeah. I want to say I said this at the last panel as well, but thanks so much for the insight. It's been really invaluable. We've talked a lot about pitching initial stories, but all of us have been abroad, or most of us have gone abroad already, written a lot of pieces. And I was just wondering if the process of pitching a story that's already been written, that's already been produced to a publication, differs from pitching just the topic of a story before it's been produced.
I got the mic real quick. I think that I think it's really challenging because I think an editor. My experience is that an editor wants to get their hands in the piece. They want to be able to work it into. So even if it's done, I'll always encourage writers to send a really, really, really well thought out. You can take, if you've done the piece and you've done all the reporting, then those 2 paragraphs are going to be better than the 2 paragraphs you would have sent 6 months ago. But you can just say hey, I've done a lot of reporting on this. You don't have to say I've got a piece done and here it is as a Microsoft Word attachment. I feel like it's suicidal.
I totally agree with that. I think sending a reported story and saying I just came back and did this is a terrible idea. I have never known at least from working at the Washington Post or BuzzFeed, when we've just sort of opened a bit, and looked at it. But sending the 2 paragraphs, or you just not graph from that story and saying, I have this. Do you think you'd be interested in that? That would be more welcome.
Our process is so unique that it wouldn't ever. If somebody went out and actually shot a retro report film without us, I guess I would consider it, but I can't imagine that would ever happen.
Have some more questions? Yes? A comment? Okay. Pointing.
I just want to add to what this discussion we've just been having about. I think it's really important to maintain whatever connections you have, not only with an editor, but your professors you have now that you've established a relationship who meant something to you. Don't let them go. And I didn't do nearly as well on this as I should have along the way, but stay in touch with them. They'll help you. They care about you. They can help you as your own career develops, and as you meet someone, if you pitch an editor, if you pitch somebody, you're working with somebody. I think Allison was talking about staying in touch with pictures, but also people you meet along the way. That we had my best story about this is working with a young reporter I met in Riga, Latvia. He was just out of college in 1991 or so, and we struck up a conversation, and then he wrote me and he got in touch with me, followed up, he called me up, he came when he got to Washington, he came to see me, and then it turned out, I didn't know this, but Tom Hunley, our senior editor here, some of you have met, had a similar experience with this young man who was stringing, trying to pick up whatever he could get along the way. And over the next 15 years or longer, he stayed in touch with both of us independently. I didn't know Tom at the time. And this was David Rose, who went on to be a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner. and he's on our board today, and phenomenal reporter and journalist in person. But he, like nobody else I knew, he cultivated people. I don't think David has ever let go of anybody he's met along the way, and he's learned so much from them. And we've all, in different ways, David, he looked back and said, he's not somebody who needed much help, you would think, but he got a lot of help from a lot of us who kind of knew him along the way and just recognized that he was a young person of great talent. And you all have a lot of talent, and you should, don't be afraid of establishing relationships, because others who come before you, they really do want to help you.
It'll make you a better person generally, because you won't be mean to anybody when you realize that that person could, in 6 months or 6 years, at some point be the guy when you realize that, oh wow, I was such a jerk to them on the last story because they wouldn't share something with me, or because, you know, I was just a jerk to them, and then all of a sudden you realize that they're running some organization that like handles refugees and they're based in Greece, and you need to talk to them. Like, that's the guy that you have to go through. I mean, I think it's a good way just to remember to be nice.
I think in general, like, you know, I mean, obviously it's a very small world, but
Use the microphone, sorry, as much as you can.
ours is a very, you know, like, I mean, our community is a very, very small world, you know, just in general. You run into the same people so often, and in different countries and around the world. Like, you know, I've run into like editors and correspondents in airports in Afghanistan, like, you know, like on transits when you're like, you know, reporting in a different country. So like maintaining that relationship is so important.
So speaking of maintaining relationships, a lot of us are pretty new in our careers. So how do you suggest we start those relationships? Like as of right now, for pitching, I'm sending to like submissions@washingtonpost.com, which sounds like no one's reading that, and I know that. But
I was just about to tell you why.
Exactly. So it's like, but I don't know any editors at the Washington Post, their personal email, and they're not online. And I've done so much stalking, and it's, you know, it's harder. Maybe not Washington Post, but other like Vice, for example, purposely doesn't like put their editor stuff online. So I guess my question is like, how do you go about finding those editors and starting up a connection? And maintaining is great, but we need to start them first. So I guess how do you suggest we do that?
So I say this in a very nice way, like, you know, stalking them is the best way to do it. And now because of like social media, it's like so much easier. And I think more and more like, you know, publications, even on print, they put emails of the reporters, you know, at the bottom of the thing. So you can always email reporters, but you can find out who the editor is by going on any website, right? So in Washington Post case, like submissions at Washington Post will never really probably get you anywhere because nobody is probably reading it. Right. But if you know who the editor of Washington Post foreign section is, or who the editor of like, you know, national desk is, same thing with like, you know, you go on Twitter, it's so easy to just like, you know, look up on Twitter, and just directly contacting them, and then like, you know, following some of the things like Nick said earlier, like, you know, calling them. It's better to probably call. I get so many calls on my phone at the Washington Post, like there's people calling and pitching stories, because all you do is call the main line and say, I want to speak to the foreign desk. They'll transfer you, right? So that is one of the ways. But, you know, for someone like you who's already done a little bit of reporting, you know, you have those stories, you want to like, you know, start reaching out to these people very specifically and say, can we do coffee? I would appreciate this. Like, you know, or like organize a tour at the New York Times or organize a tour at the Washington Post. And that's how you start building those relationships.
I agree with that too. And I also think that it's important to go to conferences, you know, go to the places where these people are speaking and make a direct connection with them after a talk. The other thing you can do is join associations. There are professional associations for journalists. I'm the president of the National Press Photographers Association. So there's a lot of interaction between members. Society of Professional Journalists, so many organizations like that. You want to kind of broaden your the sweep of the people that you're interacting with, and not just rely on it when you can do it socially. And coming up to somebody after they speak at a conference, you know, you kind of approach it as a social thing and give them your comments, but then also say you have a business card, you know, and then just start collecting them business cards.
I mean, you really have to show them you're hungry. That's like the most important thing.
Do you have any more questions? I think I'm going to find this mic here. I think we have time for a couple short questions or one question for everybody. Good. Yes, yeah, great.
Sorry.
No.
Thank you all so much for being here. And I guess, Nick, this question is more specifically for you, talking about writing, like however you phrased it earlier, long and cinematic New Yorker kind of stuff, right? So I'm talking specifically with the way you're recording things and organizing things. Like, I mean, you referenced the Tyrone Hood story earlier. I mean, are you more like Gay Talese using note cards, or using Google Docs? I mean, because the more advanced I've gotten as a reporter, the longer I'm writing and the more I've struggled and tried to figure out the best way to organize and shape and then eventually finally write it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So my method, I use Scrivener is my word processor, and I use a LiveScribe pen. The LiveScribe is amazing for several reasons. One of which, it's really disarming. You're not sticking a tape recorder in someone's face. And I'll tell them as I start writing. Does everyone know what LiveScribes are? It's a pen that you get a special notepad with, and the pen has like dimpled paper, and it records, like if I was writing right now, it would capture the audio as I was writing. So I don't have to be taking down every single note. I can write orange sweater question, and then I'll just, when I go back after the interview, I just tap with my mouse on orange, on any place in orange sweater question, and it'll bring up your question at that point. And so I've got all the audio. I'm also taking notes, and like I said, I'm not sticking a recorder in someone's face. So I will generally transcribe those notes with sort of thoughts and comments, and just put them all in one long document. And then it doesn't take long before I can sort of see what the potential arc of the story is, and I'll start setting up an outline. When you've got so much material like that piece, for instance, I mean, I think that so oftentimes in terms of words in my sort of note document, I'm talking sometimes like 200,000 words of notes that go into a 6, 7, 8, 9,000 word piece. So I'm going through each interview and I'm highlighting what I think I want to use. And I'm oftentimes putting an X at the top of that interview so that I then know what material I've actually inserted into the sort of working outline I've got. So all the time I'm building and putting stuff in. And then at the end, I've got this, oftentimes like 30, 40,000 word outline that's got a bunch of extraneous stuff, but then I can start kind of winnowing that down. It takes me a long time to write, probably because it's not the most efficient way to do it. But that way I know that I know that with each sort of swipe, I'm not missing any material, I'm not overlooking any material, and everything that I've gotten, I know I wanted to put in, and I sort of give it a second and third thought before I decide whether it stays in the piece or not.
Really quick clarification, if I could, when you're saying these 200,000 word transcripts, so is that like different sources? You're literally having just one long document that's 200,000 words or something?
Yeah, exactly. But I'll have, within that, and also make up a new Scrivener file for each story. So I've got one that's all notes. I've got one that's questions. I've got one that's my outline. I've got, one once I start writing, I'll write by section rather than writing by the whole piece. And so then I can just combine them in the end. It's so much easier to be working. It's so much easier to be working on a smaller piece of material. I went and saw Don DeLillo speak in New York a couple of weeks ago. He writes one paragraph per page. Now it was a really bizarre sort of cantankerous conversation, but he delighted in the fact that he writes one paragraph per page, because then he can see, and then he stacks up the pages. So for a novel, he'll have like this on it. Which again, I don't think that writers are necessarily the most efficient, but
climate friendly.
So that's that's generally how I proceed. I'm always looking for a new efficient way. So if anybody has a better way, I'm doing.
Well, I want to thank you all for, and if you have more questions, maybe we can talk on the way. Some of you guys who are coming to lunch, I think in about 10 minutes, I don't have a watch on, in about 10 minutes, we're going to walk over to India Gate, and it's a very short walk, but if you guys have questions for our speakers here, I'm sure they'll be happy to stay a moment. Or maybe we'll kind of go out there so you're not all crowded in the back. But I really want to thank all of you for giving us, it's golden advice, the kinds of things that you guys told us. And I think definitely the journalists here will agree. So thanks.
Thank you.